Daniel Cross's mop hit the floor the same moment bullets tore through the precinct's front windows. Glass exploded inward like deadly rain, and while seasoned detectives dove for cover, the janitor's eyes tracked something else entirely. The angle of fire, the coordinated timing, the deliberate targeting of the evidence room. In 3 seconds, he'd mapped the entire ambush. In 5, he'd identified the insider who'd made it possible. But revealing what he saw would mean exposing who he used to be, and that was a death sentence he'd promised his daughter he'd never risk again. Before we dive into Daniel's story, I want to invite you on this journey with me. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with all of you. Now, let's begin. The fluorescent lights of the 7th precinct cast everything in shades of exhaustion. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Daniel Cross pushed his maintenance cart past the booking desk with the kind of invisibility that came from years of perfecting it. The wheels squeaked. He'd been meaning to oil them for weeks, but the noise had become part of his camouflage, a sound so routine that people stopped hearing it the same way they stopped seeing him. "Watch it!" Detective Marcus Chen snapped, sidestepping the cart without looking up from his phone. His coffee sloshed, and Daniel murmured an apology that went unacknowledged. Chen was already past him, heading toward the stairs, his attention absorbed by whatever message had just pinged through. Daniel continued his circuit, his reflection ghosting across the glass partition that separated the main floor from the detective's bullpen. He was 42 but looked older, the kind of weathering that came from hard years and harder choices. His maintenance uniform hung loose on a frame that had once carried 30 more pounds of muscle, and his dark hair was threaded with premature gray that he'd stopped trying to hide. His face was forgettable by design. No distinguishing marks, no memorable features, just the kind of everyday plainness that let him slip through spaces without leaving impressions. The precinct was winding down from second shift, that liminal space between the chaos of evening and the eerie quiet of graveyard hours. Officers clustered around desks, finishing paperwork with the weary efficiency of people who'd done the same task 1,000 times. Phones rang intermittently. Someone's radio crackled with dispatcher codes. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled its last dregs into a pot that wouldn't be cleaned until Daniel got to it. "Danny, you got the 3rd floor bathrooms yet?" Officer Rodriguez called from his desk, not bothering to look up. "Someone decorated them pretty good after we brought in that drunk and disorderly." "I'll get to it," Daniel said, his voice deliberately mild. Rodriguez had been calling him Danny for 3 years now, despite Daniel correcting him exactly once before deciding it wasn't worth the effort. Most people here didn't bother learning his actual name. He was just the janitor, or maintenance guy, or sometimes, "Hey you." He'd been working at the 7th precinct for 4 years, and in that time he'd become part of the architecture, noticed only when something needed cleaning or fixing, otherwise as invisible as the security cameras mounted in the corners. It was exactly what he needed it to be. Daniel maneuvered his cart toward the evidence room, where Detective Laura Hayes was signing off on a chain of custody form. She didn't acknowledge his presence as he began emptying the trash bin near the door, her focus entirely on the paperwork in front of her. Laura Hayes was a contradiction wrapped in sharp edges, 36 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail and eyes that missed nothing when they bothered to look. She had a reputation for being the precinct's best investigator and its coldest operator, someone who solved cases through sheer relentless logic and gave exactly zero consideration to office politics or hurt feelings. "This better be right this time," she said to Officer Brennan, who was hovering nervously by the evidence locker. "The last chain got kicked because someone couldn't be bothered to initial properly." "It's all there, Detective Hayes," Brennan stammered, clearly intimidated. Most people were. Laura scanned the form with the precision of someone checking a bomb schematic, then signed with a sharp, decisive motion. "Tell the DA's office I'll have the supplementary report by Friday." She turned on her heel, nearly colliding with Daniel's cart. "Sorry," he said automatically, already moving the cart aside. She passed without a word, without a glance, without the slightest acknowledgement that he existed. It wasn't personal. Laura treated everyone below her professional threshold the same way. Daniel had watched her for 4 years, though, and he knew things about her that the polish and precision didn't reveal. He knew she worked longer hours than anyone else in the department. He knew she came in on her days off. He knew that sometimes, Late at night, when she thought she was alone in the bullpen, her face would crack just slightly, revealing something that looked like exhaustion or loneliness, or perhaps both. He knew because invisibility gave him the freedom to observe, and observation was a habit he couldn't break even after years of trying. Daniel finished with the trash and moved toward the break room, where the night shift was congregating for their ritual complaints about coffee quality and insufficient overtime pay. The conversation washed over him as he wiped down counters and restocked paper towels. "Heard Henderson's retirement party is next month," someone was saying. 28 years on the job. Must be nice, actually making it to pension. Speaking of which, anyone heard about the Mendoza trial? Word is the defense might get the whole case tossed on a technicality. Hayes' lead on that, right? She'll figure it out. Woman's a machine. Daniel kept his head down, his movements methodical. The Mendoza case. He knew about that too. Drug trafficking operation, 3 years of investigation, 17 arrests. The evidence was solid, but defense attorneys were good at finding cracks. He'd overheard enough late-night conversations between Hayes and the DA's office to know they were worried about something in the chain of custody. Not his business, not his concern. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Emma's asleep. No homework problems tonight. She's an angel." Daniel allowed himself a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes but softened something in his chest. Emma. His daughter. The reason he pushed a mop in a place where people looked through him like he was made of air. She was 8 years old now, with her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn determination, and she was everything good that had ever happened to him. "Thanks, Mrs. Chen," he texted back. "Home by 7 a.m. The night dragged on with familiar monotony. Daniel worked his way through the building floor by floor, room by room, picking up the detritus of law enforcement, discarded coffee cups, forgotten files, the occasional evidence bag that had missed the proper bin. He'd learned the rhythms of the precinct, the way a musician learned a complicated piece, knowing when to be present and when to disappear, understanding the unspoken rules of a space that operated on hierarchy and protocol. At 2:15 a.m., he was on the second floor, buffing the hallway outside the interrogation rooms, when raised voices filtered through one of the doors. He couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was getting worked over. That careful dance between legal questioning and psychological pressure that cops had perfected over decades. The door opened suddenly, and Detective Hayes emerged with Detective Chen right behind her. "Telling you, something doesn't add up," Hayes was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "The timeline's wrong. We're missing something." "You're overthinking it," Chen replied, loosening his tie. "We got 3 witnesses placing him at the scene. His prints on the weapon. Well, what else do you need?" "Context," Hayes snapped. "Motive that makes sense. This guy has no priors, no known gang affiliations, no reason to suddenly start executing people in parking garages." Chen shrugged, clearly done with the conversation. "Sometimes people just snap. Not everything has a complicated explanation." Hayes' jaw tightened, but she didn't press further. Chen headed toward the stairs, and Hayes stood in the hallway for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe, her eyes distant. Then she noticed Daniel, or rather, she noticed the buffing machine he was operating, and her attention sharpened. "How long have you been here?" she asked, her tone neutral but assessing. "Just started this section," Daniel said, which was technically true even if he'd heard the last minute of their conversation. "Should I come back later?" "No, you're fine." She studied him for a beat longer than necessary, and Daniel felt that familiar prickle of exposure, the sense that she was actually seeing him rather than looking past him. Then the moment passed, and she walked away, pulling out her phone. Daniel returned to his work, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over what he'd heard. A case that didn't add up. No priors, no affiliations, no sensible motive. The kind of inconsistency that suggested either a frame job or missing information. Again, not his business. He'd left that world behind. But old habits didn't just die. Sometimes they just went dormant, waiting. The rest of the night passed without incident. Daniel finished his rounds at 6:30 a.m., logged out with the night supervisor, and headed for the parking garage where his 15-year-old Honda sat between a squad car and someone's overpriced BMW. The sun was just starting to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, promising a clear day. He'd sleep for a few hours, then pick Emma up from school, help with homework, make dinner, and start the whole cycle over again. It was a good life, a quiet life, a safe life. He was 3 steps from his car when his phone rang, Mrs. Chen again, which was unusual. She never called unless something was wrong. "Mrs. Chen?" he answered, his heartbeat already accelerating. "Is Emma—" "Emma's fine," Mrs. Chen said quickly. "But Daniel, you need to see the news. Something happened at the precinct. They're saying there was an attack." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He spun around, looking back at the building he'd just left. Quiet, normal, showing no signs of crisis. But even as he watched, he saw patrol cars pulling in fast, lights flashing, officers running toward the entrance. "What happened?" he demanded, already moving back toward the building. "Shooting," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaky. "During a prisoner transport, they're saying officers are down." Daniel broke into a run, his maintenance uniform and invisible status forgotten in the sudden sharp clarity of old instincts roaring back to life. He hit the building's rear entrance just as chaos erupted through the halls, officers shouting, radio traffic exploding with urgent calls, someone screaming for medical assistance. The main floor was a war zone. The front windows had been shot out, glass everywhere, bullet holes stitching across walls and desks. Officers were taking cover behind overturned furniture, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for threats. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with something copper and terrible that Daniel recognized immediately. Blood. "Active shooter!" someone was yelling. "Multiple shooters! They hit the transport van!" Daniel's training took over before his conscious mind could object. His eyes swept the scene in one comprehensive snapshot. 7 officers visible, 3 wounded, defensive positions poor, exposure to the blown-out windows creating kill zones. Outside, through the shattered glass, he could see the prisoner transport van riddled with bullets, its back doors hanging open. And lying motionless on the floor near the booking desk was Detective Chen, a spreading pool of red beneath him. "Officer down!" Hayes's voice cut through the chaos, and Daniel spotted her pressed against the wall near the evidence room, her weapon drawn, her face locked in that cold combat focus. "We need medical now!" 2 more gunshots cracked from outside, and everyone flinched back. Daniel moved on instinct, using the maintenance cart, which had been abandoned in the middle of the floor, as cover while he assessed the situation. 3 seconds of observation told him what no one else had apparently noticed. The shooting had stopped. The active threat was gone. This had been a hit-and-run ambush, surgical and specific, but everyone was still treating it like an ongoing firefight, which meant they weren't helping the wounded. "They're gone," Daniel said, his voice louder than intended, carrying authority he immediately regretted. Several officers turned toward him, confusion breaking through their panic. "What?" Officer Rodriguez said. "The shooters," Daniel continued, knowing he'd already crossed a line but unable to stop. "They hit the transport, extracted whoever was in it, and left. Approximately 45 seconds ago based on the echo pattern of the last shots. The threat is mobile now, not static." Hayes's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "How the hell would you—" "Because I can hear," Daniel said flatly. "No more shots. No engine noise close by. They're gone, which means you need to be helping Chen and the others instead of maintaining defensive positions against empty air." For one crystalline moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then Hayes moved, holstering her weapon and dropping to Chen's side, her hands immediately going to pressure points to slow the bleeding. Her action broke the spell, and other officers surged forward to help the wounded. Daniel stayed where he was, pressed against his maintenance cart, his heart hammering as he realized what he'd just done. Noticed. Analyzed. Commanded. All the things he'd promised himself he'd never do again. Hayes was barking orders now, coordinating the response with the precision of someone trained for crisis. "Rodriguez, seal the building. Brennan, pull security footage. Someone get me a description of the transport van and who the hell was in it." She glanced up at Daniel just for a second, and something shifted in her expression. Confusion, calculation, suspicion. "And someone find out how a janitor knows acoustic surveillance patterns." Daniel didn't answer. He was already backing away, trying to disappear again, but it was too late. He'd been seen, really seen. And in his experience, being seen was the first step toward being exposed. An exposure was something he'd buried a past to avoid. The next hour was controlled chaos. EMTs arrived and rushed Chen and two other wounded officers to the hospital. Crime scene techs swarmed the building, photographing bullet trajectories and collecting shell casings. The brass showed up, captains and commanders with grim faces and questions nobody could answer yet. Daniel tried to make himself useful by cleaning up broken glass, staying peripheral, rebuilding his invisibility. It wasn't working. He felt eyes on him repeatedly, officers pausing in their duties to glance his way, whispers passing between them. Hayes, especially, kept looking at him with that assessing stare, like he was a puzzle she was working to solve. When she finally approached him, he was sweeping glass into a dustpan, trying to look as unremarkable as possible. "Daniel Cross, right?" she said, pulling out a small notebook. "Not Daniel, not Danny, his actual name." "Yes, ma'am." "You've worked here how long?" 4 years. He kept sweeping, didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry about what happened. About Detective Chen. He's alive," Hayes said. "Critical but stable. You probably saved his life, actually. Getting everyone to stop treating this like an active shooter situation meant medical got to him faster." She paused, studying him. "How did you know the shooters were gone?" Daniel considered lying, then discarded it. She'd see through anything too polished. "I spent some time overseas, military. You develop an ear for when shooting stops being suppressive fire and starts being extraction cover." "Military," Hayes repeated, writing something down. "What branch?" "Army." "What did you do in the Army?" "Maintained equipment mostly. Supply chain logistics." The lie came smooth and practiced, honed over years of being asked similar questions. "Nothing dramatic, just learn to pay attention to details." Hayes's pen paused over her notebook, and Daniel knew she'd caught something in his tone or phrasing, some tell he hadn't quite managed to hide. She looked at him directly, and for a moment he saw past the cold detective exterior to the sharp intelligence beneath. "Supply chain logistics," she said slowly. "That teach you acoustic surveillance patterns?" "Teach you to listen for trouble," Daniel corrected carefully. "Supply convoys in hostile territory. You learn when a situation changes from dangerous to clear. Same principle." It was plausible enough that she couldn't outright challenge it, but flimsy enough that she clearly didn't believe him. Hayes closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "We're going to need a full statement from you. Everything you saw, heard, and noticed. You might have details that could help us." "Of course," Daniel said, though his stomach was knotting. "Whatever helps." "Captain's going to want to talk to you too," Hayes added. "Not every day a janitor spots things trained officers miss." There was something in her voice. Not quite admiration, not quite suspicion, somewhere in between. "Where'd you serve?" "Overseas, I mean." "Afghanistan mostly, some other places." True, as far as it went. He'd spent plenty of time in Afghanistan, just not doing what he'd implied. Hayes studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Get that statement written up. Drop it on my desk before end of shift." She started to walk away, then paused. "And Cross? Thank you. Chen's got 2 kids. You got him help faster than he would have otherwise." "Just doing what anyone would do," Daniel said quietly. "No," Hayes said, meeting his eyes again. "You really didn't." She walked away, leaving Daniel standing amid broken glass and blood spatter, the weight of exposure settling around his shoulders like a familiar, unwanted coat. By the time Daniel finished his written statement, carefully sanitized of anything too revealing, the morning shift had fully taken over, and the precinct was a hive of focused investigation. He learned through overheard conversations that the prisoner who'd been extracted was a man named Victor Salazar, a mid-level player in a drug trafficking organization who'd been cooperating with prosecutors. His testimony was supposed to be the cornerstone of a massive RICO case. Now he was gone. 3 officers were wounded, and everyone was scrambling to figure out how the ambush had happened. Daniel was walking past the bullpen when he heard Hayes's raised voice from the conference room where the investigative team had gathered. "Not a coincidence," she was saying. "Salazar's transport schedule was classified. Only people who knew were in this room or the DA's office. Someone talked." You're suggesting we have a leak? That was Captain Morrison, the precinct commander, his voice heavy with offense. I'm suggesting we have a serious security problem, Hayes shot back. They knew exactly when and where that van would be, and they had the firepower to punch through it like tissue paper. Professional extraction team, military-grade coordination. This wasn't some gang members with pistols. Daniel slowed his walking pace, his cleaning supplies giving him an excuse to linger near the conference room door. Through the half-open door, he could see Hayes standing at the head of the table, her laptop open, crime scene photos displayed on a screen behind her. What's your recommendation? Morrison asked. Lockdown on all sensitive information, Hayes said immediately. No more shared documents, no more general briefings. We narrow the circle to essential personnel only, and we audit everyone's communications for the last month. You want to investigate our own people? Detective Brennan said, sounding offended. I want to find out how Salazar's people knew to hit that van, Hayes snapped. And I want to do it before someone else gets killed. Chen's lucky he's alive. Next time we might not be. There was murmuring around the table, half agreement, half resistance. Daniel could read the room dynamics even from outside. Hayes was pushing for something that would make everyone uncomfortable, but she was also right, and most of them knew it. Fine, Morrison said heavily. Implement your protocols, but Hayes, you're lead on this. Any fallout, it's on you. Understood, sir. The meeting broke up, and Daniel quickly resumed his walking, pushing his cart toward the stairs. He'd heard enough, more than enough. A leak investigation meant scrutiny, questions, digging into people's backgrounds. The kind of attention that could crack open carefully constructed cover stories. He needed to be more careful, more invisible. The exposure from this morning had already put him on Hayes's radar, and she was exactly the type to dig when something didn't sit right. Daniel spent the rest of his shift keeping his head down and his observations to himself. When officers discussed the ambush within earshot, he made himself tune out, focusing on the mindless repetition of cleaning tasks. When Hayes passed him in the hallway later that afternoon, he kept his eyes down, mumbled a greeting, became the unremarkable janitor again. But he couldn't unknow what he'd heard, couldn't unhear the implications. Someone in this building had betrayed their own, had gotten cops shot, had aided the extraction of a prisoner whose testimony could have dismantled a criminal organization. And somewhere in the back of Daniel's mind, in that part of him that had once been very different, a cold analytical voice was already turning over pieces of the puzzle, assembling a picture from overheard conversations and observed behaviors, doing exactly what he'd trained himself not to do. Noticing, analyzing, hunting. He was so focused on suppressing those instincts that he almost missed the moment that would change everything. It was 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the end of his shift. Daniel was in the basement, emptying the trash from the file storage area, when he heard voices echoing down the stairwell, harsh, urgent, trying for quiet, but failing. He paused, his hand stilling on the trash bag. "Told you to wait," someone was saying. Male voice, strained. "This is too soon." "We don't have a choice." Different voice, also male. "Hayes is already digging. If she finds the connection, she won't. There's nothing to find." "There's always something to find. You need to move up the timeline." Daniel moved silently toward the stairwell, positioning himself where he could hear better while staying out of sight. The angle was wrong to see who was speaking, but the voices continued, clearer now. "Moving the timeline means more risk," the first voice said. "More chances for something to go wrong. More chances of getting caught if we don't," the second voice countered. Salazar was supposed to buy us time. Instead, it brought Hayes down on everyone like hellfire. We need to act before she locks everything down. "When?" "Tonight. The transport is already arranged. Just make sure the security protocols are disabled on your end." "And after?" "After you disappear. We've got your exit set up. New identity, accounts in the Caymans, everything we promised. You just have to hold it together for 12 more hours." There was a long pause. Daniel barely breathed, his body absolutely still. "Tonight, then," the first voice said finally. "But if this goes wrong, it won't. Trust the plan." Footsteps retreated up the stairs, and Daniel remained frozen in the basement, his mind racing. Another extraction. Tonight. Security protocols being disabled from the inside. He'd just overheard a conspiracy that confirmed Hayes's worst suspicions. There was absolutely a leak in the precinct, and whatever was being planned was happening in hours. The smart move was to walk away. Finish his shift, go home to Emma, pretend he'd heard nothing. He wasn't a cop. This wasn't his responsibility. Getting involved would mean exposure, scrutiny, risk to the invisible life he'd built. But Chen was in the hospital with bullets in him. Other officers had been wounded, and if Daniel did nothing, more people, good people, who were just trying to do their jobs, might die tonight. He stood in the basement for a full minute, torn between self-preservation and something that felt uncomfortably like conscience. Then he pulled out his phone and did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He involved himself. The text to Hayes was simple and anonymous, sent from a burner app that wouldn't trace back to his number. There's another extraction plan tonight. Security protocols being disabled from inside. Check your transport schedules and recent communications. Someone in your house is dirty. He hit send before he could reconsider, then immediately deleted the app and cleared his phone's history. It wasn't much, no proof, no names, no specifics that could make him a target, but it was enough to give Hayes a warning. And that, Daniel told himself as he finished his shift and headed home, was the absolute last time he'd stick his neck out. The universe, as it turned out, had other plans. Daniel's hands were steady as he unlocked his apartment door at 7:23 a.m., but his mind was still churning through the implications of what he'd overheard. The hallway smelled like Mrs. Chen's cooking, something with garlic and ginger that made his empty stomach remind him he hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Emma would already be awake, probably watching cartoons before school, and he needed to shake off the precinct and become dad again. The transformation used to be harder. These days, it happened the moment he saw her face. "Daddy!" Emma launched herself off the couch the second he stepped inside, her dark braids flying behind her as she crashed into his legs with the full force of 8-year-old enthusiasm. "Mrs. Chen made me pancakes, the good kind with chocolate chips. Did she now?" Daniel lifted her up, ignoring the protest from muscles that were feeling every one of his 42 years. "What do we say when people are nice to us?" "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." Emma called towards the kitchen, where their neighbor was already gathering her things. Mrs. Chen emerged, a small woman in her 70s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd raised 4 children and wasn't impressed by much anymore. "She's a good girl," she said to Daniel. "Homework's done. Lunch is packed. You look terrible, by the way." "Long night," Daniel said, setting Emma down. "Thank you for staying over." "That thing on the news? At your work?" Mrs. Chen's expression tightened with worry. "You weren't there when it happened?" "I was fine," Daniel said, which was technically true even if it avoided the actual question. "Building's secure now. Nothing to worry about." Mrs. Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but glanced at Emma and held her tongue. "You call if you need anything," she said instead, squeezing his arm. "And Daniel, be careful. Whatever happened there, it's not safe." She was gone before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how right she was. "Daddy, can we have breakfast together?" Emma asked, tugging his hand. "You didn't eat yet, right?" "Right," Daniel admitted. "But you've got school in 40 minutes, so let's make it quick." They settled into their morning routine, Emma chattering about her upcoming field trip to the Science Museum while Daniel made eggs and toast, half listening while the other half of his mind replayed those voices in the stairwell. Tonight. The transport is already arranged. He needed to sleep, but sleep felt impossible with that anonymous text hanging over everything like a grenade with the pin pulled. What if Hayes didn't believe it? What if she did believe it but couldn't act in time? What if his warning made things worse instead of better? "Daddy, you're not listening," Emma said, her tone taking on that particular note of 8-year-old accusation. "Sorry, sweetheart." Daniel forced his attention back to her. "Tell me again about the planetarium show." Emma launched into an elaborate description of constellations and star formation, and Daniel let her voice anchor him in the present. This was why he'd walked away from his old life, for ordinary mornings with chocolate chip pancakes and stories about field trips. For the privilege of being boring and safe and present. After he dropped Emma at school, Daniel returned to his apartment with every intention of sleeping for at least 5 hours. Instead, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his body exhausted but his mind refusing to shut down. He kept running scenarios, analyzing variables, doing tactical assessments he had no business doing anymore. At 11:30 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely and turned on the news. The ambush at the 7th Precinct was the lead story. Detective Marcus Chen's condition had been upgraded to serious but stable. The other wounded officers were recovering. Victor Salazar remained at large, and the mayor was promising a full investigation. The police chief stood at a podium, his face grave, promising that whoever was responsible would face justice. Standard political theater. None of it addressed what Daniel actually needed to know: whether Hayes had received his message, whether she believed it, whether anything was being done. His phone buzzed, and Daniel's heart rate spiked until he saw it was just a reminder about Emma's parent-teacher conference next week. He set the phone down and forced himself through the motions of a normal day: laundry, grocery shopping, meal prep for the week, ordinary tasks that kept his hands busy while his mind worked problems he shouldn't be working. By the time he headed back to the precinct for his evening shift, Daniel had convinced himself that his anonymous text had probably been dismissed as a crank message. Hayes had no reason to trust an unknown source, and without specifics, there was nothing actionable in the warning. He'd done what he could. Now he needed to let it go and focus on staying invisible. The precinct was transformed when he arrived at 10:45 p.m. Security had been tripled, officers stationed at every entrance, metal detectors set up in the lobby, visitor logs being scrutinized with new intensity. The shattered front windows had been boarded up and covered with heavy plastic sheeting, giving the building a wounded, defensive appearance. Daniel signed in with Officer Rodriguez, who actually looked at him for once instead of waving him through. "New protocols," Rodriguez explained, checking Daniel's ID against a list. "Everyone gets screened, no exceptions, captain's orders." "Makes sense," Daniel said, submitting to a cursory bag search. His cleaning supplies were examined, his maintenance cart inspected. When Rodriguez finally cleared him through, Daniel could feel the shift in atmosphere. The precinct had gone from confident to paranoid overnight, and paranoid organizations made mistakes. He found out just how paranoid when he reached the 3rd floor and discovered Detective Hayes standing outside the interrogation rooms, her arms crossed, her attention fixed on something through the one-way mirror. She looked like she hadn't slept, her ponytail slightly disheveled, her blazer rumpled in a way that suggested she'd never gone home. Daniel intended to walk past without engaging, but Hayes turned at the sound of his cart's squeaky wheel. "Cross," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I need to talk to you." Every instinct Daniel had screamed at him to make an excuse and leave, but Hayes was already moving toward him with the focused intensity of a woman who'd made a decision and wouldn't be deterred. "Ma'am?" he said, defaulting to neutral deference. Hayes glanced around the hallway, then gestured toward an empty office. "In here. Now." It wasn't a request. Daniel followed her into the cramped space, his stomach knotting as she closed the door behind them. The office belonged to someone on vacation, family photos on the desk, a jacket hung on the back of the chair, everything neat and undisturbed. Hayes turned to face him, and her expression was unreadable. "I got an interesting text message this morning," she said. "Anonymous. Burner app. No way to trace it." Daniel kept his face carefully blank. "Okay." "It warned me about another extraction being planned. Said security protocols were being disabled from inside." Hayes was watching him with that assessing stare, the one that made Daniel feel like every lie he'd ever told was written across his forehead. "You know anything about that?" "I'm a janitor, detective," Daniel said, careful to sound confused rather than defensive. "I don't know anything about extractions or security protocols." "That's funny," Hayes said, pulling out her phone. "Because the anonymous source used some very specific language. Said to check transport schedules and recent communications. Said someone in your house was dirty. Not our house or the precinct, but your house. Like someone who works here but doesn't think of themselves as part of the department." Daniel's pulse was racing, but he maintained his neutral expression. "I don't understand what you're asking me." Hayes studied him for a long moment, and Daniel could practically see her mind working, assembling pieces. "What were you doing in the basement yesterday? Between 6:30 and 6:50. "Emptying trash from file storage," Daniel said. True as far as it went. "Why?" "Because that's right around when this message was sent. And you were in a location that's directly below the administrative offices, where voices from the stairwell would echo down. Hayes stepped closer, and her voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. I ran a security check on everyone in the building yesterday. You know what I found? Your military record is sealed, not classified, not restricted, sealed, like someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure nobody could see what you actually did in the army. Daniel's mouth went dry, but he held her gaze. I was told that's standard for certain postings. For intelligence operatives, sure. For supply chain specialists? Not so much. Hayes' eyes narrowed. You're not who you say you are, Cross. I don't know exactly what you are, but janitors don't have sealed military records and don't know acoustic surveillance patterns. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Daniel calculated his options: deny everything and hope she couldn't prove anything, or give her just enough truth to explain his knowledge without revealing what he used to be. I worked in sensitive locations, he said finally, choosing his words with extreme care. Security for supply convoys that serviced classified operations. That's why the record's sealed, but I haven't done that work in years and I can't help you with whatever investigation you're running. Can't or won't, Hayes challenged. Both. Daniel moved toward the door, desperate to end this conversation before he said something he couldn't walk back. If you don't need me for anything else, I have work to do. Hayes didn't stop him, but her voice followed him out. Someone in this building is going to die tonight, Cross. If you know something that could prevent that and you choose to stay silent, that's on your conscience. Daniel paused in the doorway, his hand tight on the handle. The weight of her words settled on him like a physical thing, pressing down on decisions he'd made years ago about who he would be and what he would risk. He thought about Emma, about the life he'd built, about all the promises he'd made to himself about never going back. Then he thought about Chen in the hospital, about the other wounded officers, about Hayes' comment that Chen had 2 kids. If you're running an operation tonight, Daniel said without turning around, keeping his voice low, check your team for anyone who's been in significant financial distress recently. Whoever flipped, they were bought. Look for unexplained debts being paid off, new assets appearing, sudden lifestyle changes. That could be half the department, Hayes said, but there was a note of consideration in her voice. Then narrow it to people who had access to Salazar's transport schedule, Daniel continued, and to whatever operation you're running tonight. Cross-reference those lists. You'll find your leak. He left before she could respond, his heart hammering as he pushed his cart down the hallway with deliberate calm. He'd just crossed another line, offered tactical advice that no janitor should know how to give. But if it saved lives, if it stopped whatever was being planned, the rationalization felt thin even to him. Daniel spent the next 2 hours trying to work normally while tracking the building's unusual activity. Extra officers were moving with purpose through the halls. Conference room lights stayed on well past when they should have dimmed. Radio chatter increased in volume and urgency. Something was happening, building toward a crescendo he could feel but not quite see. At 1:15 a.m., he was mopping the second-floor hallway when Officer Brennan hurried past, talking urgently into his radio. Need confirmation on the transport route. Hayes wants redundancy on all checkpoints. Daniel's grip tightened on the mop handle. They were running an operation. Tonight, exactly as the voices in the stairwell had discussed. And if those voices were correct, security protocols were about to be disabled from the inside. He abandoned his mop and moved quickly toward the emergency stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time down to the basement. The file storage area was empty this time of night, just rows of metal shelves and banker's boxes containing years of case records. Daniel navigated to the far corner where the building's security junction box was located, a gray metal panel that housed the wiring for cameras, alarms, and access controls. He'd noticed it months ago during a routine cleaning, noted its location with the kind of automatic assessment he couldn't turn off. Now he opened the panel and examined the wiring, looking for anything out of place. There. A small device, no bigger than a USB drive, attached to one of the main circuit boards, the kind of hardware that could disable specific systems on remote command. Professional-grade military surplus, exactly what someone with the right connections could acquire. Daniel photographed it with his phone, then carefully detached it from the circuit board. He was pocketing the device when footsteps echoed from the stairwell, quick, purposeful, heading his direction. Told you it's handled, a voice was saying. Male, strained, familiar from somewhere. The protocols will drop exactly when we need them to. Daniel moved silently behind a shelf unit, pressing himself into shadows as two figures entered the storage area. In the dim emergency lighting, he could make out their profiles: Officer Jason Brennan and someone in civilian clothes, a man Daniel didn't recognize. "You better be right," the civilian said. "We've got 12 million in product moving tonight. If anything goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Brennan insisted, moving toward the junction box. "I've got the remote trigger right here. When your team hits the transport, I'll drop the cameras and locks. They'll think it's a system glitch until it's too late." "And Hayes?" "She's got the wrong transport route," Brennan said with something ugly in his voice. "Send her team to guard a decoy while the real shipment moves through the south corridor. By the time she figures it out, we'll be clear." The civilian laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Salazar, send his regards if you see Hayes. Tell her he's sorry about her partner." "Chen wasn't her partner," Brennan said, but there was hesitation in his voice, maybe the first crack in whatever justification he'd built for his betrayal. "Doesn't matter. He got in the way." The civilian checked his watch. "Transport moves in 20 minutes. You disable those protocols at exactly 1:45. Not before, not after." "I know the schedule." "Then we're done here." The civilian headed toward the stairs, then paused. "And Brennan? Don't even think about backing out now. You're in this. If you try to flip, your family learns about your gambling debts and where the money to pay them off really came from. Understood?" Brennan's shoulders slumped. "Understood." The civilian disappeared up the stairs and Brennan stood alone in front of the junction box, his hand hovering over the panel. In the shadows, Daniel could see the officer's face and the misery written across it. This was a man who'd made a terrible choice and was living with the consequences, caught between betrayal and destruction with no clear way out. Daniel had exactly 3 seconds to make a decision. Let Brennan disable the security and allow Hayes' team to walk into an ambush, or stop him and blow his own cover completely. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Daniel stepped out of the shadows. "Officer Brennan?" Brennan spun around, his hand going to his weapon.
"Jesus Christ, Cross? What the hell are you doing down here?"
"Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life," Daniel said quietly, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Don't touch that panel." Brennan's eyes widened as he processed the situation. The janitor who shouldn't be here, who'd somehow overheard everything, who was standing between him and the only way to save his family from financial ruin. Daniel watched the calculation happen in real time, watched Brennan's fear twist into desperation. "You don't understand," Brennan said, his voice cracking. "They'll destroy everything. My house, my wife's business, my kid's college fund. I'm in debt for $300,000. This is the only way out." "There's always another way," Daniel said. "But not if you get cops killed. Hayes' team is walking into an ambush. If you disable those protocols, they're going to the wrong location anyway." Brennan's desperation was becoming anger, a cornered animal's aggression. "Hayes got bad intel. Her team won't even be there when the transport moves." "Then why disable the security at all?" Daniel pressed. "If Hayes is at the wrong place, what's the real transport you're trying to protect?" Brennan's face went pale, and Daniel knew he'd struck true. There was a transport, probably drugs based on the civilian's comment about 12 million in product, and Hayes had somehow gotten close enough to make the conspirators nervous. "Walk away, Cross," Brennan said, his hand still on his weapon. "This doesn't concern you. You're just a janitor. Go back to your mops and stay invisible like you always do." "I can't do that," Daniel said simply. "And you know I can't. You're better than this, Brennan. Whatever debts you've got, whatever pressure they're putting on you, it's not worth becoming the reason other cops die." For a moment, Daniel thought he might actually get through. Brennan's hand relaxed slightly on his weapon, and something human flickered in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or regret. Then Brennan's radio crackled. "Brennan, report. Are you in position?" The moment shattered. Brennan's expression hardened, and he drew his weapon fully, pointing it at Daniel's chest. "Get on the ground, now!" Daniel didn't move. "You won't shoot me. You're dirty, but you're not a murderer. Not yet." "You don't know what I am," Brennan said, but his hands were shaking. "You don't know what they'll do to my family if I don't follow through." "So don't follow through," Daniel said. Right now, you're just a cop who made some bad financial decisions and got pressured into providing information. That's prosecutable, but it's not life in prison. The second you disable those protocols and people get hurt, you're an accessory to assault on law enforcement. Maybe murder. Your family won't have a house or a college fund because you'll be spending the next 20 years behind bars. Brennan's face was anguished, the weapon wavering. They'll kill me. If I don't do this, they'll kill me. Then we get you protection, Daniel said. We go to Hayes right now, tell her everything, get you into protective custody along with your family. She's running an operation tonight. She's got resources mobilized. She can help you. She'll arrest me. Probably, Daniel admitted. But you'll be alive. And so will whatever cops you're about to get killed. The radio crackled again, more insistent. Brennan, confirm your status. Transport is rolling in 10 minutes. Brennan looked at the radio, then at Daniel, then at the junction box where the device Daniel had already removed should have been. His eyes widened as he realized the panel had been tampered with. What did you do? He demanded. Took out their remote trigger, Daniel said. Your civilian friend is going to push a button in 10 minutes and nothing will happen, which means they're going to know something went wrong and they're going to know you're the only person who could have stopped it. Brennan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, and finally a desperate kind of understanding. He'd been made, whether he cooperated or not. The only question now was which side he'd end up on when everything fell apart. Where's Hayes? Brennan asked finally, lowering his weapon. Where's her team really going? I don't know, Daniel said. But you do. You said she had the wrong transport route, which means you know the right one. Brennan's radio crackled a third time. Brennan, if you don't respond in 30 seconds, we're aborting and assuming compromise. Daniel held out his hand. Give me the radio. Let me talk to Hayes. We can still stop this. Brennan stared at Daniel's outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, he unclipped his radio and handed it over, his shoulders sagging in defeat or relief. Daniel couldn't tell which. Daniel keyed the transmission. This is Daniel Cross, maintenance. I need to speak with Detective Hayes immediately. Priority emergency. Static, then confusion. Maintenance? This is a secured channel. How did you... Get me Hayes, Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying command authority he hadn't used in years. Right now, lives are at risk. More static, arguing voices in the background. Then Hayes's voice cut through. Cross? What the hell is going on? You've got a dirty cop, Daniel said without preamble. Officer Jason Brennan. He's been feeding information to the people who hit the transport yesterday. They set you up tonight, gave you a fake location while they moved the real shipment through the south corridor. Silence on the other end. Daniel could practically hear Hayes's mind racing, connecting pieces. How do you know this? She demanded. Because I'm standing in the basement with Brennan right now, and he just tried to disable your security protocols remotely. I have the device they planted, and I have Brennan ready to cooperate if you promise him and his family protective custody. More silence. Then, where exactly is this real transport moving? Daniel looked at Brennan, who had his head in his hands. Tell her, Daniel said gently. Brennan looked up, tears tracking down his face. Loading Dock C, he said hoarsely. Underground garage, south exit. 3 vehicles, heavily armed security. They're moving 12 million in fentanyl disguised as cleaning supplies. If you hit them in the garage, you can trap them before they reach street level. Daniel relayed the information, then added, Hayes, they know you're onto something. When Brennan didn't disable the security, they're going to realize the operation's compromised. You've got maybe 5 minutes before they either accelerate or abort. Copy that, Hayes said, and Daniel could hear orders being barked in the background, the rapid reorganization of an operation pivoting on new intelligence. Cross, keep Brennan there. Don't let him leave that basement. I'm sending officers to secure both of you. Understood, Daniel said, then paused. Hayes? Brennan cooperated. He wants to protect his family. Whatever happens after this, I'll do what I can, Hayes interrupted. But he's still dirty, Cross. He enabled the ambush that put Chen in the hospital. There are limits to what I can promise. Fair enough. The radio went dead. Daniel set it down and looked at Brennan, who was slumped against the wall, looking like a man who just watched his entire life implode. My wife, Brennan said quietly. My kids. They're going to hate me. Maybe, Daniel said, sitting down on a nearby crate. Or maybe they'll understand that you tried to make it right before anyone else got hurt. Either way, you made the choice that lets you look them in the eye someday. Brennan laughed bitterly. From prison. Better than from a grave. They sat in silence for a moment, two men in a basement waiting for consequences to arrive. Then Brennan looked at Daniel with something like curiosity cutting through his misery. Who the hell are you, really? He asked. You're not just a janitor. The way you moved, the way you assessed that device, the way you gave orders over the radio like you'd done it 1,000 times, that's not supply chain logistics. Daniel considered lying, then decided Brennan had earned at least partial truth. Someone who used to do very different work, someone who came here to disappear and stay invisible, someone who has a daughter waiting at home and really didn't want to get involved in any of this. But you did anyway. Yeah, Daniel said, I did anyway. Footsteps pounded down the stairs, multiple officers, moving fast. They found Daniel and Brennan exactly where Hayes had been told they'd be, and within seconds, Brennan was cuffed and read his rights, while Daniel was pulled aside for immediate questioning. The next hour blurred into controlled chaos. Hayes arrived within minutes, her face tight with focus, as she coordinated both the operation at the loading dock and the securing of potential evidence in the basement. The loading dock operation went down fast and hard. 3 vehicles blocked, 9 suspects arrested, enough fentanyl to kill half the city seized before it hit the streets. No officers were wounded, no shots were fired. Complete success. Hayes debriefed Daniel in the same small office where they'd talked earlier, her questions rapid and precise. How had he known about the device in the junction box? What exactly had he overheard? What was his relationship with Brennan? Daniel answered carefully, giving her enough to explain his actions without revealing capabilities that would raise more questions than they answered. You just happened to be in the basement at the exact right time, Hayes said, her skepticism obvious. And you just happened to have the technical knowledge to identify and remove a sophisticated security bypass device. And you just happened to have the tactical sense to know how to turn a dirty cop instead of just reporting him. Lucky timing, Daniel said, knowing she didn't believe him. Right. Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying him with that assessing look he was starting to dread. I ran a deeper check on you after our conversation earlier, took some calling in of favors, some creative database searches. You know what I found? I'm sure you'll tell me. 7 years ago, you appeared out of nowhere. No employment history before that, no tax records, no digital footprint. It's like Daniel Cross didn't exist before you showed up in this city and took a minimum wage janitorial job despite having skills that could land you 6-figure positions. Daniel kept his expression neutral. People start over sometimes. Not like this, they don't, Hayes said. This is witness protection level erasure. The kind of thing that takes federal resources and serious motivation. So either you're running from something, you're hiding from someone, or you're protecting something so important that you'd rather push a mop than use whatever skills made your military record get sealed in the first place. The silence between them stretched taut with implications. Daniel could see Hayes assembling her puzzle, getting closer to a picture that would destroy the safe, invisible life he'd built for Emma. I have a daughter, Daniel said finally, giving her the only truth that mattered. She's 8 years old. She's the reason I'm here, the reason I do this work. The reason I stay invisible. Whatever you think you've figured out about me, keep it to yourself, for her sake, not mine. Hayes' expression softened fractionally, the cold detective exterior cracking just enough to show the human underneath. Fair enough, she said. But Cross, if you've got skills that could help this department, skills that could save lives, using them doesn't have to mean exposing yourself. There are ways to consult, to contribute from the shadows. No, Daniel said firmly. Tonight was a one-time thing. An emergency. It's over now. Is it? Hayes challenged. Because Brennan isn't the only dirty cop. This operation was too sophisticated, too well coordinated. There's more corruption in this building, and now that we've kicked the hornet's nest, they're going to come after anyone who helped bring them down. That's your problem, not mine. It becomes your problem when they figure out you're the janitor who stopped their security bypass, Hayes said. You think they won't ask questions? Won't connect dots? You saved our operation tonight, Cross, but you also painted a target on yourself. Daniel felt cold dread settle in his stomach because Hayes was absolutely right. He'd exposed himself not just to the police, but to the criminal organization that had bought Brennan and orchestrated the attack. And if they started digging into who'd interfered with their plans... His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. "Emma's fine, sleeping soundly. Don't worry about us." The message was innocuous, routine, but it landed on Daniel like a physical blow because it reminded him exactly what he'd put at risk by getting involved. Emma. Everything he'd sacrificed to protect her. All the promises he'd made about staying invisible and keeping her safe. "I need to go," Daniel said, standing abruptly. "If you need anything else, call me. But I'm done here." Hayes stood too, blocking his path to the door. "You can't just walk away from this, Cross. These people don't forget, they don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't let threats to their operation just disappear." "Watch me," Daniel said, moving past her. But as he left the precinct in the gray light of early morning, heading home to his daughter and the ordinary life he'd tried so hard to preserve, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of Hayes's warning. Some things, once started, couldn't be stopped by simply walking away. And somewhere in the city, people who'd lost $12 million and a strategic operation were already asking questions about how it had all fallen apart. The questions started 3 days later. Daniel was changing a light bulb in the third-floor conference room when he noticed the black SUV parked across the street from the precinct. It had been there for 20 minutes, engine running, windows tinted dark enough to be illegal. Nobody was getting in or out, just watching. His hands continued their work with the bulb, steady and unremarkable, while his mind cataloged details with the automatic precision he'd never managed to completely suppress. Late model Escalade, dealer plates removed, premium trim package suggesting serious money behind it, positioned for optimal surveillance of both the main entrance and the parking garage. Professional operation, not some amateur stakeout. They were looking for someone, and Daniel had a sinking feeling he knew who. "Cross, you got a minute?" Daniel turned to find Captain Morrison standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Morrison was career law enforcement, 58 years old, with gray temples and the kind of bearing that came from 30 years of navigating department politics. He rarely spoke to maintenance staff directly, which meant this conversation was going to be anything but routine. "Of course, sir," Daniel said, climbing down from the stepladder. Morrison closed the conference room door behind them, a gesture that immediately elevated Daniel's heart rate. "Detective Hayes tells me you've been helpful with our recent situation." "Just happened to be in the right place," Daniel said, defaulting to his standard deflection. "Right." Morrison's tone suggested he found that explanation exactly as credible as Hayes had. "The thing is, Cross, helpful civilians sometimes become targets when they interfere with serious criminal operations. I wanted to make sure you understood the potential risks." I appreciate the concern, Captain, but I'm not." "There's a black Escalade across the street," Morrison interrupted. "Been there since 8 a.m. Shifted positions twice to maintain line of sight on our exits. That's surveillance, Cross. Professional grade. And it started showing up right after we seized $12 million in product and arrested 9 people connected to a major distribution network." Daniel kept his expression neutral even as his stomach knotted. "Could be watching anyone in the building." "Could be," Morrison agreed. "But they showed up 3 days after a janitor with a mysteriously sealed military record stopped one of the biggest drug operations this city's seen in a decade. That's not coincidence, son. That's targeting." The blunt assessment hung in the air between them. Daniel wanted to argue, to maintain his carefully constructed invisibility, but Morrison's eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that cut through convenient lies. "What do you want me to do about it?" Daniel asked finally. "For now, be aware. Vary your route home. Don't follow predictable patterns. If you notice anyone following you, call it in immediately." Morrison paused, then added, "Hayes also mentioned you have a daughter." The mention of Emma sent ice through Daniel's veins. "She has nothing to do with any of this." "I'm sure she doesn't," Morrison said. "But people like the ones we disrupted don't always make that distinction. They go after leverage, Cross. Family, friends, anyone who matters to their target. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the stakes of what you've gotten yourself into." I didn't get myself into anything, Daniel said, his voice harder than intended. I stopped a dirty cop from getting good people killed. That's it. I'm not looking for involvement in your investigation, and I'm definitely not interested in becoming a target. Too late for that, Morrison said bluntly.
The moment you removed that security bypass device and turned Brennan, you became relevant to very dangerous people. Now the question is what you're going to do about it. Daniel wanted to walk away, to insist this wasn't his problem, but the image of that black Escalade kept replaying in his mind. Professional surveillance meant professional operators, which meant someone with serious resources was asking questions about who'd interfered with their operation. And if they were watching the precinct, how long before they followed him home? Before they saw him pick up Emma from school? Before his daughter became leverage in a situation he'd created by refusing to stay invisible?
What are you suggesting? Daniel asked carefully. Morrison moved to the window, looking down at the street where the Escalade continued its patient watch. Hayes thinks you have skills that could help us. Skills beyond cleaning floors and changing light bulbs. I'm inclined to agree with her assessment. I'm not a cop.
No, you're not, Morrison agreed. But you're someone who knows how to see things others miss, how to think tactically, how to operate in situations most people can't handle. Whatever you were before you became a janitor, Cross, that person is exactly who we need right now to figure out how deep this corruption goes.
Daniel shook his head. I can't. I have responsibilities. My daughter. We'll be safer if we identify and neutralize the threat, Morrison interrupted. Right now, you're a loose end. Someone who knows too much and isn't protected by the department. That makes you vulnerable. But if you work with us, officially or unofficially, we can provide security. For you and your family.
I don't need your security, Daniel said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Morrison turned from the window, his expression hard. That Escalade says otherwise. Look, Cross, I don't know what you're running from or what you're trying to protect.
But I do know that burying your head in the sand doesn't make you safe. It just makes you an easy target. Help us, and we help you. That's the deal. Daniel wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries he'd built around his new life, but Morrison's logic was brutally sound. He'd already exposed himself by stopping Brennan. The question now wasn't whether he was a target, it was how he was going to handle being one. What exactly are you asking me to do? Daniel said. For now, just what you've been doing. Keep your eyes and ears open. Report anything unusual. Hayes is convinced there are more dirty cops in this building, and Brennan's cooperation has given us leads but not conclusions. We need someone on the inside who can move through the precinct without raising suspicion, someone people ignore. Morrison's expression was almost sympathetic. Someone invisible. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. The very quality he'd cultivated for safety was now being weaponized into usefulness. And if I say no? Then you're on your own when those surveillance teams start asking harder questions, Morrison said. I can't force you to help, Cross, but I can tell you that cooperation is your best chance of keeping your daughter safe. It was a hell of a choice, wrapped in a threat, delivered with pragmatic honesty. Daniel looked out the window at the black Escalade, thinking about Emma at school, about Mrs. Chen who watched her, about the quiet life he'd built that was already crumbling around the edges. I want protection for Emma, Daniel said finally, and Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who watches her, around the clock if necessary, non-negotiable. Done, Morrison said immediately. Plainclothes officers rotating shifts. Your daughter won't even know they're there. And when this is over, when you found whoever else is dirty and shut down their operation, I go back to being nobody. Just a janitor. No recognition, no awards, no press conferences. Total anonymity. Agreed. Morrison extended his hand. Do we have a deal? Daniel stared at the offered hand, thinking about all the promises he'd made to himself about staying invisible, about protecting Emma from the life he'd left behind. But Hayes had been right. You couldn't just walk away once you'd gotten involved. The threat didn't disappear because you wanted it to. He shook Morrison's hand. We have a deal. Morrison's grip was firm, sealing an agreement that felt like stepping off a cliff. Good. Hayes will brief you on what we know so far. In the meantime, act normal. Go about your routine. Just keep your eyes open and your phone closed. One more thing, Daniel said as Morrison moved toward the door. That Escalade. Are you going to do anything about it? Already have units tracking it, Morrison said. But Cross? If they're watching you here, they're probably watching your home too. Be careful. The warning followed Daniel through the rest of his shift like a shadow he couldn't shake. He went through his maintenance routine with mechanical precision, but his awareness had expanded to include every face, every conversation, every anomaly in the precinct's normal rhythm. The old training was coming back whether he wanted it to or not. Threat assessment, pattern recognition, tactical thinking that turned ordinary spaces into maps of sightlines and exposure points. At 3:15 p.m., he took his break in the parking garage, ostensibly to smoke a cigarette he didn't actually light. What he really did was sweep the area for surveillance, checking vehicles for occupants, cameras for tampering, any sign that the watchers outside had found a way inside. He didn't find anything obvious, which bothered him more than if he had. Professionals knew how to stay hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Hayes. Conference room B, 4 p.m. Come alone. Daniel deleted the message and continued his rounds, counting down the minutes until the meeting with a mixture of dread and resignation. He'd agreed to help, but that didn't mean he was comfortable with what helping would require, stepping back into patterns of behavior he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. Conference room B was in a secure section of the 3rd floor, accessible only with a key card that Daniel technically wasn't supposed to have, but had acquired months ago during a late-night maintenance emergency. Hayes was already there when he arrived, along with 2 other detectives Daniel recognized but had never formally met. Detective Sarah Kim, mid-30s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and Detective Marcus Rivera, a bear of a man with the kind of calm competence that came from years of undercover work. "Close the door," Hayes said without preamble. "We don't have much time, and there's a lot you need to know." Daniel closed the door and remained standing, uncomfortable with the sudden shift from invisible maintenance worker to operational asset. The 3 detectives were looking at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism, clearly trying to reconcile the janitor they'd ignored for years with whoever Morrison and Hayes had described. "Detective Kim and Detective Rivera are working the corruption investigation," Hayes said, pulling up files on a laptop. "Everything discussed in this room is confidential. You repeat nothing, not even to other officers. Understood?" "Understood," Daniel said. Hayes pulled up a photograph. Officer Brennan, looking miserable in an interrogation room. Brennan's been cooperating, but he's a foot soldier, not a mastermind. He was recruited 18 months ago when his gambling debts hit critical mass. They offered to clear his debts in exchange for intelligence, transport schedules, operation details, personnel movements. Low-level stuff at first, then escalating. "Who recruited him?" Daniel asked. "That's the problem," Detective Kim said, her voice clipped and professional. "Brennan dealt with intermediaries. He never met the actual decision-makers. Everything was handled through encrypted messages and dead drops. By the time we arrested him, the communication channels had already been burned." Hayes pulled up another image, a blurry surveillance photo of a man in his 40s, expensive suit, distinctive scar along his jawline. "This is Victor Salazar, the prisoner who was extracted during the ambush. He was cooperating with the DA's office on a RICO case against the Alvarez cartel. His testimony would have taken down their entire distribution network in 3 states. "Would have?" Daniel noted the past tense. "Salazar disappeared after the extraction," Hayes said, "either dead or relocated out of the country. Either way, his testimony's gone, and with it, 18 months of investigation. The Alvarez cartel is back in business, and they're pissed about the $12 million we seized during your intervention." Detective Rivera leaned forward, his massive arms crossed. "The black Escalade outside? Probably Alvarez people. They're asking questions, trying to identify who disrupted their operation. So far, we've kept your name out of official reports, but it's only a matter of time before they connect the dots." "How?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Process of elimination," Kim said. "They know someone inside the precinct interfered. They'll run through personnel lists, look for anomalies, interview people who might have seen something. Eventually, someone mentions the janitor who was in the basement at the wrong time, who had knowledge he shouldn't have. After that," she trailed off meaningfully. "After that, I become a problem they need to solve," Daniel finished. "Exactly," Hayes said, "which is why we need to move fast. Brennan gave us 3 other names, cops he thinks might be compromised. We need to verify his information without tipping them off. That's where you come in. She pulled up 3 personnel files. Daniel recognized all of them: Officer Anthony Diaz, Detective Linda Walsh, and Sergeant Robert Freeman. People he passed in hallways, whose trash he emptied, whose conversations he overheard. Invisible background to their daily work. Diaz has financial red flags, Hayes explained. Paid off a second mortgage last year with no clear source of income. Walsh took 3 unscheduled vacation days right before major operations, including the Salazar transport. Freeman has a cousin who was arrested on drug charges 5 years ago and mysteriously got all charges dropped. Circumstantial, Daniel observed. Very, Rivera agreed. Which is why we can't just arrest them. We need proof, recordings, documentation, witnessed exchanges, something that'll stand up in court. And you want me to find that proof, Daniel said, understanding now why Morrison had been so willing to offer protection in exchange for cooperation. Hayes met his eyes. You move through this building like you're invisible. You're in rooms when people don't think anyone's listening. You see things people don't bother hiding because they don't consider you a threat. She paused. That's an advantage we can't replicate any other way. Daniel thought about the ethics of what they were asking, using his invisibility as a weapon, spying on people who'd never seen him as worthy of notice. But then he thought about Chen in the hospital, about Emma needing protection, about the black Escalade waiting patiently to identify its target. What exactly do you need me to do? He asked. Hayes pulled up a detailed surveillance plan that looked like it had been prepared by someone with military intelligence experience. Specific observation points, recording protocols, behavioral indicators of compromise. As she walked him through the operation, Daniel realized with grim irony that they were asking him to do exactly what he'd been trying to avoid: going operational again, using skills he'd buried, becoming the person he'd been before Emma was born. We've installed audio monitoring in 3 key locations, Kim explained, highlighting areas on a building schematic. Break room near the detective's bullpen, maintenance closet on the 2nd floor, and the locker room in the basement. All legally authorized under the corruption investigation warrant. But the recordings need context, someone who can observe the suspects and correlate their behavior with what's being said. You want me to watch them, Daniel said. See who they're meeting, what they're doing when they think nobody's paying attention. Exactly, Rivera said. You don't need to confront anyone. Just observe and report. If you see something suspicious, you document it and pass it to us. We'll handle the actual investigation. It sounded simple, but Daniel knew better. Observation work was dangerous precisely because it required sustained proximity to targets who were already paranoid. One mistake, one moment of unusual attention, and he'd be exposed. And unlike his old life, where exposure meant mission failure, here it meant putting Emma directly in the crosshairs. How long? Daniel asked. 2 weeks, Hayes said. Maybe less if we get lucky. Brennan's cooperation has the other dirty cops spooked. They're going to make moves, have conversations, try to figure out how compromised they are. That's when they'll slip up. And if they don't slip up in 2 weeks? Then we reassess, Hayes admitted. But Cross, these people are nervous. When criminals get nervous, they make mistakes. We just need to be watching when they do. Daniel studied the 3 files again: Diaz, Walsh, Freeman. People he'd worked alongside for years without really seeing, just as they'd worked alongside him without seeing. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. I'll do it, he said, but I need direct communication with one of you at all times. If something goes wrong, I'm not waiting around for proper channels. I call, you answer. Agreed, Hayes said, handing him a new phone. This is a secure line. My number's programmed in, along with Kim and Rivera. GPS enabled so we can track your location. If you're in trouble, just hit the emergency button and we'll mobilize response immediately. Daniel pocketed the phone, feeling its weight like a promise and a threat combined. What about the Escalade outside? If they follow me home, they already know where you live, Rivera said bluntly. We've had surveillance on your building since yesterday. They've done 3 drive-bys, 1 prolonged observation from a vehicle parked 2 blocks away. So far, just intelligence gathering, but it'll escalate. The casual confirmation that dangerous people knew where Emma slept sent a cold fury through Daniel that he had to work to suppress. How close have they gotten? Not close enough to be an immediate threat, Kim said. But they're building a profile, watching your patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. The protection detail Morrison promised is already in place. 2 officers in an unmarked car on your street, rotating every 8 hours. Your daughter's school has been notified to only release her to you or Mrs. Chen, and we've got eyes on both locations. Will that be enough? Daniel asked, hating the uncertainty in his own voice. Honestly, Hayes said, we don't know. The Alvarez cartel has resources and patience. They might try intimidation first, following you, making their presence known, trying to scare you into silence. Or they might go directly to violence if they think you're a serious enough threat. That's why we need to move fast on identifying the remaining dirty cops. The sooner we shut down their intelligence network, the safer you and your family become. Daniel absorbed that, running tactical scenarios in his head despite himself. If the cartel wanted him dead, they'd already had opportunities. The fact that they were still watching suggested they weren't sure yet whether he was worth the risk of targeting, which meant he had a window, narrow and closing, to become either irrelevant or too protected to touch. When do we start? He asked. Now, Hayes said, pulling up a schedule. Diaz works swing shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. He's usually in the break room around 4:30, gets coffee, and makes personal calls. That's your first observation window. Just be in the area, natural as always, and note who he talks to and what he does. Daniel checked his watch, 4:17 p.m. I can do that. Remember, Rivera cautioned, you're not law enforcement. You don't have arrest authority, qualified immunity, or backup if things go sideways. If you see something criminal happening in progress, you call us. You don't intervene. Clear? Crystal, Daniel said, though they all knew that instruction existed more for liability purposes than practical application. If violence erupted in his presence, he'd respond with whatever training his body remembered, legal authority or not. Hayes walked him to the door, her expression unreadable. Cross, I know this isn't what you wanted when you took a job cleaning floors, but you're good at this. Better than you should be for someone whose military record claims you manage supply chains. Whatever you really were before, that person might be exactly who we need right now. That person doesn't exist anymore, Daniel said quietly. Doesn't he? Hayes challenged. Because the person I've seen over the last 3 days, the one who identified an ambush by sound patterns, turned a dirty cop, and removed a sophisticated security device, that person sure looks real to me. Daniel didn't have an answer for that, so he just nodded and left, heading toward his maintenance cart with thoughts churning. Hayes was right, and that was exactly the problem. The person he'd been was resurfacing despite every effort to keep him buried, pulled back to life by circumstances that made invisibility impossible and action necessary. He reached the 3rd-floor break room at 4:28 p.m., just as Officer Diaz was pouring coffee from the perpetually half-empty pot. Daniel began restocking paper towels in the dispenser, his movements routine and unremarkable, while his awareness expanded to include every detail of Diaz's behavior. Diaz was 34, fit but with the soft edges that came from desk work, his uniform crisp and his badge polished to high shine. He had a reputation as a solid cop, good arrest record, decent clearance rate, no major complaints. The kind of officer who blended into the department's background competence without standing out for exceptional skill or notable failure. He was also, according to Brennan, providing intelligence to the Alvarez cartel. Diaz checked his phone while his coffee cooled, his expression tense. Then he made a call, keeping his voice low, but not quite low enough. Can't talk long, Diaz was saying. But yeah, it's bad. They got Brennan, and he's singing. No, I don't know what he told them yet, but Morrison locked down all the sensitive files. Nobody's getting access without direct authorization. Daniel focused on the paper towel dispenser, his hands working while his ears captured every word. I'm being careful, Diaz continued, irritation creeping into his voice. But if they start looking at financials, the mortgage thing is going to raise questions. I told you that payment was too visible. A pause. What do you mean lay low? I can't just stop coming to work. That'll look even more suspicious. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel risked a glance and saw Diaz's jaw tighten with what looked like fear or anger, probably both. Fine, Diaz said, but if this goes sideways, if they come after me, we had a deal. Protection, relocation, all of it. I'm not going down alone.
He ended the call abruptly and stood there for a moment, staring at his coffee like it might contain answers. Daniel finished with the paper towels and moved to empty the trash, keeping his face blank while his mind recorded every detail. Diaz was scared, feeling exposed, and apparently had a deal that included protection and relocation if things fell apart.
That suggested organization, resources, and a support structure beyond simple payoffs for intelligence. Diaz left without drinking his coffee, his phone already out for another call. Daniel waited 30 seconds, then followed at a careful distance, tracking the officer's path through the building while maintaining the appearance of routine maintenance work. Diaz headed to the locker room. One of the areas Kim had mentioned was under audio surveillance. Daniel couldn't follow there without raising suspicion, so he positioned himself in the nearby hallway, organizing cleaning supplies in a maintenance closet whose door he left strategically open. 3 minutes later, Diaz emerged looking slightly calmer, like he'd received reassurance or instructions that settled his nerves. The rest of Daniel's shift passed in careful observation, tracking Diaz's movements and interactions while maintaining his invisible janitor routine. He noted 3 phone calls, 2 in-person conversations with other officers that looked innocuous but might not be, and 1 moment where Diaz appeared to deliberately avoid Detective Walsh in the parking garage, possibly significant, possibly coincidence. At 11:47 p.m., Daniel clocked out and headed for his car, hyper-aware of his surroundings. The black Escalade was gone, but that didn't mean the surveillance had ended, just that it had become less obvious. He varied his route home as Morrison had suggested, taking an extra 20 minutes to loop through side streets and confirm he wasn't being followed. The unmarked police car on his street was exactly where Rivera had promised, 2 officers visible in the front seats trying hard to look casual. Daniel didn't acknowledge them, just headed inside where Mrs. Chen met him at the door. "She's asleep," Mrs. Chen said softly. "No problems tonight." But Daniel, those policemen outside, "Is everything all right?" "Just a precaution," Daniel said, hating how easily the lie came. "Nothing to worry about." Mrs. Chen's expression said she knew he wasn't telling the whole truth, but she didn't press. "Be careful," she said simply, gathering her things. "That girl needs her father." After Mrs. Chen left, Daniel checked on Emma, curled up in her bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit, breathing deep and even, completely unaware that her father's choices had painted a target on their quiet life. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, thinking about all the promises he'd made about keeping her safe. Then he went to his room, pulled out the secure phone Hayes had given him, and typed out his first intelligence report. Diaz received call approximately 4:30 p.m. in break room. Confirmed Brennan cooperation. Mentioned mortgage payment visibility as concern. Referenced deal, including protection and relocation. Advised to lay low by unknown caller. Appeared nervous throughout shift. Avoided contact with Detective Walsh in parking garage at approximately 11:15 p.m. Possibly significant. He hit send and sat in the dark, listening to the city sounds filtering through his window, waiting for consequences he couldn't see but knew were coming. The response from Hayes came 30 seconds later. "Good work. Continue observation tomorrow. Be careful." Daniel set the phone aside and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop running scenarios, assessing threats, calculating odds the way he'd been trained to do in another lifetime. The problem with going operational again, even in this limited capacity, was that it woke up parts of himself he'd worked hard to put to sleep. The hypervigilance, the tactical thinking, the constant threat assessment, it all came roaring back with terrible familiarity. He was still awake at 3 a.m. when his secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from Hayes. "Activity at precinct. Diaz and Walsh meeting in parking garage. Can you get there?" Daniel was out of bed and dressed in under 2 minutes, his body responding with muscle memory before his conscious mind fully processed the request. He paused at Emma's door, thinking about waking Mrs. Chen, but the protective detail outside meant Emma was covered. He couldn't pass up an opportunity to observe Diaz and Walsh together. That was exactly the kind of corroborating evidence Hayes needed. The precinct was 20 minutes away at normal speed. Daniel made it in 12, running red lights and pushing his aging Honda past any speed it had achieved in years. The parking garage was mostly empty at this hour, just a few patrol cars and personal vehicles belonging to graveyard shift staff. And there,
In the far corner, under flickering fluorescent lights, were Officer Diaz and Detective Walsh, standing beside Walsh's sedan, their body language suggesting an argument barely kept under control. Daniel parked 3 rows away, killed his engine, and pulled out his phone to record video. The angle wasn't great, but it captured their interaction clearly enough. He sent the live feed to Hayes with a text. On scene. Recording. Through his phone screen, Daniel watched Diaz gesture angrily, while Walsh maintained an icy calm that suggested she was the dominant player in whatever relationship they had. Their voices were too quiet to hear from this distance, but their body language told a story. Diaz panicking, Walsh managing, neither of them aware they were being documented. Then Walsh pulled out an envelope and handed it to Diaz, who opened it and went pale. Whatever was inside terrified him more than the investigation apparently did. He tried to give it back, but Walsh refused, pointing at him with the kind of gesture that suggested consequences for non-compliance. Daniel zoomed his phone camera in as much as the cheap lens allowed, trying to capture detail. The envelope was standard business size, unmarked, containing what looked like photographs, though he couldn't make out specifics. Whatever they depicted, they were effective leverage. Diaz's resistance crumbled in seconds. Walsh spoke for another minute, her expression never shifting from professional calm, then got in her car and drove away. Diaz stood alone in the parking garage, holding the envelope like it was poisonous, his face a mask of despair. Daniel kept recording as Diaz pulled out his phone and made a call, his free hand shaking visibly even from 3 rows away. The conversation was brief, then Diaz walked to his own car, got in, and sat there without starting the engine. Just sitting, barely moving. A man realizing he was trapped. Daniel ended the recording and sent the full video to Hayes with a message. Walsh handed Diaz envelope containing photographs. Appeared to be leverage or threat. Diaz made call immediately after. Need cell records. Both subjects highly agitated. Walsh controlled, Diaz borderline panic. Recommend immediate tactical approach before either can alert handlers. Hayes' response came through 30 seconds later. Copy. Do not engage. Exit area now. We're mobilizing. Daniel was already moving, starting his car and pulling out of the garage through the exit opposite where Diaz was still sitting. He was 2 blocks away when he saw the first unmarked police units racing toward the precinct, lights concealed but sirens starting to wail. Hayes was making her move, and Daniel had just provided the evidence that would justify it. He drove home through the early morning darkness, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind racing. This was escalating faster than anyone had anticipated. Within hours, maybe minutes, Diaz and Walsh would be in interrogation rooms, and the remaining corruption network would know their exposure was complete, which meant the Alvarez cartel would know too. And desperate organizations with billion-dollar stakes didn't react to exposure with calm acceptance. They reacted with violence, swift and decisive, aimed at eliminating threats before they could testify. Daniel thought about the Black Escalade, about the surveillance teams Rivera had mentioned, about Emma sleeping peacefully in her bed protected only by 2 officers in an unmarked car. He thought about Hayes' warning that he couldn't just walk away once he'd gotten involved. And he realized with cold certainty that the most dangerous part of this operation wasn't observation or intelligence gathering, it was what came after. The retaliation phase. The moment when criminals decided that removing witnesses was worth more than avoiding attention. Daniel was pulling onto his street when he saw it. A different SUV, dark blue instead of black, parked 4 houses down from his building with its engine running and interior lights off. The protective detail's unmarked car was still in position, but they were focused on his building's entrance, not on vehicles approaching from the opposite direction. Daniel drove past his building without slowing, his heart rate spiking as training took over. He pulled around the corner, parked, and pulled out the secure phone with hands that were finally starting to shake. Blue SUV on my street, 4 houses south of my building, running engine, lights off, protective detail hasn't noticed. Possible hostile surveillance or prep for action. Hayes responded immediately. Stay in vehicle. Units rolling to your location. ETA 3 minutes. 3 minutes felt like an eternity when your daughter was sleeping 400 feet away from potential threats. Daniel got out of his car and moved toward his building on foot, staying in shadows, his entire body coiled with readiness for violence.
The blue SUV's doors opened. Two men stepped out of the blue SUV, and Daniel's entire body shifted into a state of readiness he hadn't accessed in 7 years. The first man was Latino, early 30s, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done violence before and expected no resistance. The second was older, broader, with a face that suggested Eastern European ancestry and hands that stayed near his waistband where weapons usually lived. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. This was the moment Hayes had warned about, when surveillance turned into action, when questions became threats, when Daniel's interference stopped being an abstract problem and became something that required permanent resolution. Daniel pressed himself against the brick wall of a neighboring building, his mind running combat calculations with the cold efficiency of muscle memory. Two hostiles, possibly armed, moving toward his building where Emma slept. The protective detail was still focused the wrong direction, unaware of the approach from their blind spot. Hayes's units were still 90 seconds out, maybe more depending on traffic. 90 seconds was an eternity in tactical time. The men moved with purpose toward his building's side entrance, the one residents used when they didn't want to pass the main lobby, the one Daniel used every night when he came home from his shift. They knew his patterns, had mapped his life, were executing a plan that had been carefully constructed through days of observation. Daniel's phone buzzed silently in his pocket. Hayes trying to reach him, probably telling him to stay back, to wait for support, to let trained officers handle the situation. But trained officers weren't here yet, and Emma was on the 3rd floor directly above where these men were about to enter. He moved before conscious thought could intervene, before fear or common sense could slow him down. 23 feet separated him from the two men. Daniel covered it in 4 seconds, his footsteps silent on concrete, his approach angle calculated to minimize their reaction window. The Latino man sensed movement and started to turn, his hand going for his waistband. Daniel hit him before the weapon cleared, a precise strike to the throat that collapsed the man's trachea and sent him stumbling backward, choking, no longer a threat. The second man was faster, his gun already out, already rising toward Daniel's center mass. Daniel twisted inside the weapon's arc, his left hand catching the man's wrist and forcing the gun up and away while his right drove into the man's solar plexus with enough force to crack ribs. The gun discharged, a sound like thunder in the quiet street, and somewhere behind them the protective detail's car doors were opening, officers shouting commands. But Daniel wasn't stopping. The Eastern European was tough, well-trained, recovering from the body shot faster than expected. He tried to reverse Daniel's wrist control, using size and strength to his advantage. Daniel responded with a knee to the thigh that deadened the man's leg, followed by a headbutt that broke the man's nose and sent blood streaming down his face. The gun clattered to the pavement. Both men went for it simultaneously. Daniel got there first, his fingers closing on cold metal, but the Eastern European caught his arm and they grappled, rolling across concrete while the Latino man recovered enough to lunge forward despite his damaged throat. Then the night exploded with commands. "Police! Drop the weapon! Hands where we can see them!" And suddenly there were 3 officers surrounding them, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel released the gun immediately, his hands going up in a gesture of compliance, even as his body stayed coiled with readiness. "I'm Daniel Cross," he said clearly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I live here." These men were attempting forced entry. The protective detail officers recognized his name. Hayes must have briefed them, and their weapons shifted to cover the 2 attackers instead. The Latino man was on his knees, still gasping for air through his damaged throat. The Eastern European had blood pouring from his nose and murder in his eyes, but he was smart enough not to move with 3 guns pointed at his chest. More sirens converged on the street, Hayes's backup arriving, along with what sounded like half the precinct. Within seconds, Daniel's quiet residential block had transformed into a crime scene. Lights flashing, radios crackling, neighbors emerging from buildings to see what the commotion was about. Daniel stood with his hands still raised, his heart hammering, thinking about Emma 3 floors up, who was definitely awake now with all the noise. Thinking about how close those men had gotten, how many seconds separated his daughter from whatever violence they'd planned to deliver. "Cross, you all right?" That was Hayes's voice, cutting through the chaos as she pushed through the responding officers.
She took in the scene with sharp eyes, Daniel standing over two subdued attackers, the protective detail officers looking sheepish about missing the approach, the gun on the pavement between them all. "I'm fine," Daniel said, though his hands were starting to shake now that the immediate threat had passed. "But those two were heading for my building, side entrance. They knew which one I use." Hayes's expression darkened. She turned to the protective detail officers with barely contained fury. "You were supposed to be watching for exactly this." "They came from the opposite direction," one officer started to explain, but Hayes cut him off with a gesture. "Not now." She focused on Daniel. "Did they say anything? Make any demands?" "No time," Daniel said. "They were moving for entry when I intercepted." "Intercepted?" Hayes repeated, looking at the Latino man who was being helped into an ambulance, his throat swelling visibly. "You crushed his trachea and broke the other one's nose. That's some impressive interception, Cross." Daniel met her eyes, seeing the questions there that she wasn't asking in front of other officers. Questions about what kind of supply chain specialist could take down two armed attackers in under 10 seconds without sustaining a scratch. "I protected my home," Daniel said simply. "That's all." Hayes studied him for another moment, then nodded. "We'll need a statement, but first go check on your daughter, make sure she's okay. We'll secure the scene." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his legs burning with delayed reaction to the violence, and found Mrs. Chen standing in his open doorway with Emma tucked behind her. The old woman had a kitchen knife in one hand and an expression that suggested she'd been ready to use it. "Daddy!" Emma broke away from Mrs. Chen and crashed into Daniel's legs, her small body trembling. "I heard loud noises. Mrs. Chen said it was fireworks, but I knew it wasn't. What happened?" Daniel knelt down, pulling Emma into a tight embrace while meeting Mrs. Chen's eyes over his daughter's head. The old woman's expression told him she knew exactly what had happened, and her disappointment in his lies was palpable. "There was an attempted break-in," Daniel said, deciding Emma deserved at least partial truth. "But the police stopped it. Everyone's safe now." "Because you were here?" Emma asked, her voice small and scared in a way that broke something in Daniel's chest. "Because lots of people were here," Daniel corrected gently. "Police officers who keep our neighborhood safe. Nothing bad happened, sweetheart. Nothing's going to happen." But even as he said it, Daniel knew it was a lie. Something bad had almost happened, and it would almost happen again because he'd made himself relevant to dangerous people, because he'd stopped being invisible and started interfering with operations that moved millions of dollars and didn't tolerate obstacles. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat softly. "Emma, why don't you go get your rabbit? He's probably scared from all the noise." Emma nodded and scurried toward her bedroom, leaving Daniel alone with Mrs. Chen's withering stare. "Don't tell me this is nothing," Mrs. Chen said quietly, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "Men with guns outside our building is not nothing. You promised when you moved here, no trouble, no danger. What happened to that promise?" "I didn't have a choice," Daniel said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "There is always a choice," Mrs. Chen countered. "You chose to get involved in something. Now that something is here, at our home, where children sleep, you need to fix this, Daniel. Not for you. For Emma." She was right. And Daniel had no defense. He'd gotten involved, and involvement had consequences that extended beyond himself to everyone he cared about. The question now was how to fix it without abandoning the commitment he'd made to help Hayes shut down the corruption network. "I'm working on it," Daniel said. "The Police cannot protect everyone all the time," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "You know this. So what are you going to do?" Before Daniel could answer, Hayes appeared at his doorway, her expression grim. "Cross, we need to talk. Now." Mrs. Chen gave him one last meaningful look, then retreated into the apartment to comfort Emma. Daniel stepped into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind him to keep the conversation from reaching his daughter's ears. "The two men you took down aren't talking," Hayes said without preamble, "but we identified them from prints. Carlos Mendoza and Victor Petrov, both with extensive criminal records. Mendoza works enforcement for the Alvarez cartel. Petrov's freelance Russian mob connections specializes in wet work." "Wet work," Daniel repeated,
the clinical term for assassination hitting him like a physical blow. They were here to kill me. That would be my assessment, Hayes said, which means the cartel has escalated from surveillance to elimination. They've decided you're too much of a threat to leave operational. Daniel leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of that reality settling on him. What about Diaz and Walsh? Are they talking? Walsh lawyered up immediately, Hayes said. But Diaz is cracking. The photographs Walsh gave him were of his family, his wife, his kids, taken without their knowledge over the past month. Basically a threat. Cooperate, or we'll make your family disappear. But between that and his guilt over Brennan, he's ready to give us everything. How much is everything? Hayes glanced around the hallway, ensuring they were alone. There are 5 dirty cops in the precinct. Diaz, Walsh, Freeman, and 2 others we hadn't identified yet. Officer Maria Santos and Detective Jeff Crawford. They've been providing intelligence to the Alvarez cartel for the past 2 years, enabling shipments, warning about operations, basically neutering our drug interdiction efforts. 5 out of how many total officers? Daniel asked. Just over 200, Hayes said, which means the vast majority of the department is clean. But those 5 did enough damage to compromise dozens of operations and get at least 2 informants killed that we know about. Daniel absorbed that, thinking about the scope of the betrayal. When will you arrest them? Already in motion, Hayes said. Santos and Crawford are being picked up as we speak. Freeman tried to run, got caught at the airport with $50,000 in cash and a one-way ticket to Costa Rica. All 5 will be in custody within the hour. Then it's over, Daniel said, trying to believe it. The corruption network is shut down. I can go back to being invisible. Hayes's expression suggested he was being dangerously naive. The corruption network is shut down, she agreed. But the Alvarez cartel is still operational, still has billions of dollars at stake, and is now extremely motivated to eliminate anyone who contributed to their loss. You took down 2 of their people tonight, Cross. You think they're just going to accept that and move on? So what are you suggesting? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer and dreaded it. Protective custody, Hayes said, for you and Emma. Full federal witness protection if necessary. New identities, relocation, the whole program. It's the only way to guarantee your safety. Daniel shook his head immediately. No. I already ran once, already rebuilt my life from nothing. I'm not doing that to Emma again. She has friends here, school, stability. I won't tear that away from her because I made bad people angry. Then what's your alternative? Hayes challenged. The cartel knows where you live. They've already sent a kill team. They'll send another and another until they succeed or we get lucky enough to catch them all before they reach you. That's not a life, Cross. That's just a slower death. I'll handle it, Daniel said, the words coming out harder than intended. Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. Handle it how? You're one person against an organization with unlimited resources and no conscience. You think you can just fight off every team they send? Eventually you'll slip up, or they'll get lucky, or they'll hurt Emma to get to you. That's how these things end. Daniel knew she was right. The rational choice was witness protection, disappearing again, starting over somewhere the cartel couldn't find them. But the thought of dragging Emma through that kind of upheaval, of stripping away everything familiar and safe in her life just when she was finally settled. Give me 72 hours, Daniel said. 3 days to find another solution. What solution? Hayes demanded. What could you possibly do in 3 days that changes this situation? Daniel met her eyes, and something in his expression must have communicated the seriousness of what he was proposing, because Hayes went very still. Don't do anything stupid, she said quietly. Don't try to be a hero. These people will kill you, Cross. They'll kill you and feel nothing about it. 72 hours, Daniel repeated. Then we'll talk about witness protection if I haven't figured something else out. Hayes looked like she wanted to argue, but something, maybe the stubborn determination in Daniel's voice, maybe simple exhaustion, made her relent. Fine. 3 days. But you stay visible, you keep that phone on, and if anything even slightly suspicious happens, you call immediately. Understood? Understood, Daniel said. Hayes turned to leave, then paused. Cross, whatever you're planning, be smart about it. Emma needs you alive more than she needs you brave. After Hayes left, Daniel returned to his apartment to find Emma asleep on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight, Mrs. Chen sitting beside her like a guardian sentinel. The old woman looked up when Daniel entered, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Something I should have done 7 years ago," Daniel said. "I'm going to end this properly instead of just running from it." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment. "You were someone dangerous once, before Emma." It wasn't a question. Daniel had never told her about his past, but Mrs. Chen saw things, had probably seen through his janitor disguise from the first day they'd met. She was just kind enough not to say anything until it mattered. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I was someone dangerous once. And now you will be dangerous again," Mrs. Chen said. "To protect her." "To protect her," Daniel confirmed. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Then you do what you must. But Daniel, when this is over, when the dangerous part is finished, you must come back to being her father, not the dangerous man, the father. She needs that more than anything." "I know," Daniel said softly. "I promise." Mrs. Chen stood, gathering her things. "I will keep Emma tomorrow. She should not be here while you work. Bring her to my apartment in the morning." After Mrs. Chen left, Daniel carried Emma to her bed and tucked her in, watching her sleep for a long moment. Then he went to his own room and made a call he'd sworn he'd never make again. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, rough with sleep and surprise. "This number shouldn't exist." "Marcus," Daniel said, "I need your help." There was a long pause on the other end. "Danny? Jesus Christ, is that really you?" "It's me," Daniel confirmed. "I'm in trouble, Mark. The kind that's going to get my daughter hurt if I don't handle it correctly." "What kind of trouble?" Marcus Reeves had been Daniel's team leader in his previous life, the closest thing to a friend someone in their line of work could maintain. They'd kept in contact sporadically after Daniel left, but Daniel had been careful never to reveal his location or new identity. Until now. Daniel explained the situation in quick, efficient sentences: the corruption investigation, the cartel's retaliation, the kill team that had almost reached Emma. Marcus listened without interrupting, processing information with the tactical mind that had kept their team alive through a dozen operations that should have killed them all. "So you need extraction," Marcus said when Daniel finished. "Full tactical support, maybe some deterrence operations to convince the cartel you're more trouble than you're worth." "Can you do it?" Daniel asked. "Can I?" "Sure. Do I want to pull you back into this world after you fought so hard to leave it?" "That's a different question." Marcus sighed heavily. "Danny, you got out clean. You built a real life. Coming back to this, even temporarily, it changes things. You know that." "I know," Daniel said. "But right now, my real life is about to get killed by people who don't care about collateral damage. I need to remove their motivation before they remove Emma." Another pause, then, "I can have a team there in 18 hours, but Danny, this gets complicated fast. Taking on a cartel isn't like our old work. These people have political connections, law enforcement on payroll, resources we can't match long-term." "I don't need long-term," Daniel said. "I just need them convinced that continuing to target me costs more than leaving me alone. Can your team do that?" "Oh, we can absolutely do that," Marcus said, and there was dark humor in his voice now. "Question is whether you're ready to become that person again, the one who makes those kinds of points." Daniel looked toward Emma's room, thinking about her sleeping peacefully while dangerous men planned her father's death, thinking about Mrs. Chen's words, "Be the father, not the dangerous man." But sometimes being the father meant becoming dangerous enough to ensure there was a future to father in. "I'm ready," Daniel said. "Then I'll see you tomorrow night," Marcus said. "And Danny, it's good to hear your voice. Missed having you watching our backs." After the call ended, Daniel sat in the dark and tried not to think about what he'd just set in motion. He'd spent 7 years building a quiet life, teaching himself to be invisible and unremarkable, convincing himself that his old skills were irrelevant to the person he'd become. Now, in the span of a week, all of that careful construction had collapsed. The question was whether he could use his old life to protect his new one without destroying everything in the process. Daniel must have dozed off at some point because he woke to pale morning light filtering through the windows and Emma's voice calling from her room. He got her ready for the day with practiced efficiency, making breakfast and packing her school bag while carefully not mentioning the previous night's violence. Emma was resilient but observant. She knew something was wrong, could feel the tension radiating off her father despite his attempts to project calm. "Are we safe, Daddy?" she asked while eating cereal, her dark eyes too serious for an 8-year-old. Daniel knelt beside her chair, meeting her gaze directly. "Yes," he said firmly, "we are safe, and we're going to stay safe, I promise." "But those men last night are in jail," Daniel interrupted gently, "and won't be bothering us again. The police are making sure of it." Emma studied him with that peculiar intensity children had when they were deciding whether to trust an adult's reassurances. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better?" "I'm saying it because it's true," Daniel said. "I won't let anything happen to you, Emma. That's the most important job I have, keeping you safe. And I'm very good at my job." That, at least, was completely honest. Whatever else Daniel had been in his previous life, he'd been exceptional at his work. And if keeping Emma safe required resurrecting those capabilities, then that's exactly what he'd do. After dropping Emma at Mrs. Chen's apartment with strict instructions not to leave for any reason, Daniel headed to the precinct for what he knew would be his last normal shift. Hayes had texted him earlier. All 5 dirty cops were in custody, and Morrison wanted to see him before he started work. The precinct felt different when Daniel arrived. Officers looked at him differently now, not through him as they had for 4 years, but at him with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and wariness. Word had spread about his takedown of 2 cartel enforcers, and apparently the story had grown in the telling. Some officers nodded as he passed. A few actually said good morning. His invisibility was completely shattered. Morrison's office was on the 4th floor, a space that reflected 30 years of accumulated commendations and career milestones. The captain was behind his desk when Daniel knocked, and he gestured for Daniel to close the door and sit. "Hell of a night you had," Morrison said without preamble. "Not my first choice for how to spend 3 a.m., Daniel admitted. Morrison almost smiled. "I imagine not. I wanted to talk to you before things get more complicated. Hayes told me you requested 72 hours before considering witness protection." "That's right." "Mind telling me what you're planning to do in those 72 hours? Morrison asked. "Because if you're thinking about taking matters into your own hands, I need to tell you that's a terrible idea on multiple legal and practical levels." "I'm not planning anything illegal," Daniel said carefully. "Just exploring options for ensuring my daughter's long-term safety that don't involve uprooting her entire life." Morrison studied him with the same assessing look Hayes used, like they'd both taken the same course in reading people who didn't want to be read. "Cross, I've been a cop for 3 decades. I've seen a lot of people in a lot of situations, and I've learned to recognize when someone's about to do something dangerous while technically staying within legal boundaries." "Is there a question in there?" Daniel asked. "Just an observation," Morrison said, "and maybe a reminder that vigilante justice tends to create more problems than it solves. Whatever your plan is, make sure it doesn't put you on the wrong side of the law you just helped us uphold." "Understood, Captain." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "The department is extremely grateful for your assistance with this investigation. Because of you, we've removed significant corruption and stopped a major drug operation. That matters, Cross. It matters to every clean cop in this building." "I appreciate that," Daniel said. "Which is why I'm going to offer you something," Morrison continued. "Not a job exactly, more like a consulting position. Someone with your skills and instincts could be valuable to our investigations unit. Flexible hours, decent pay, and most importantly, official protection. You'd be a department asset, which means threatening you becomes threatening us. That's a lot more deterrent than a civilian status provides." Daniel had to admit the offer was appealing. Official status would provide cover, resources, and legitimacy. But it would also mean exposure, paperwork, questions about his background that he couldn't answer honestly without opening doors he'd worked hard to close. "Can I think about it?" Daniel asked. "Take your 72 hours, Morrison said. "But Cross, whatever you decide about the job, about witness protection, about your future here, remember that you don't have to face this alone. The department takes care of people who take care of us. That's not an empty promise." Daniel left Morrison's office feeling the weight of decisions pressing down on him from all sides. Stay and risk Emma's safety, but maintain her stability, or run and guarantee safety, but destroy the life she'd built. Take Morrison's job offer and gain protection, but lose anonymity, or refuse and remain vulnerable but free. There were no clean choices. There never had been. His shift passed in a haze of routine work and unusual attention. Officers kept approaching him with questions or comments, breaking through years of practiced invisibility to engage with the janitor who'd turned out to be something else entirely. Daniel deflected most of it with practiced politeness, but the constant interaction was exhausting in ways physical labor had never been. At 6:00 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Team is wheels down. Meeting point is the old warehouse district, building 7. Come alone at 2200 hours. Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about the fact that he was 12 hours away from reuniting with people who'd known him in his previous life. People who understood what he'd been trained to do and what he was capable of when circumstances required it. The question was whether he was ready to be that person again, even temporarily, whether the skills he'd buried could be resurrected without corrupting the man he'd become. He thought about Emma's question that morning, "Are we safe?" And he thought about the only answer that mattered, the one he'd promised to make true regardless of cost. Yes, he'd told her, "We are safe." Now he just had to make sure that promise didn't turn into a lie. The warehouse district had been abandoned for the better part of a decade, leaving behind skeletal buildings and cracked pavement that told stories of economic decline and municipal neglect. Building 7 sat at the far end of the complex, a 3-story structure with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls that made it look like every other forgotten industrial space in the city. Daniel arrived at 9:53 p.m., 7 minutes early, out of habit. He'd left Emma sleeping at Mrs. Chen's apartment with Hayes's protective detail stationed outside and explicit instructions to call him every hour. The secure phone was clipped to his belt, a lifeline to the ordinary world he was temporarily leaving behind. The building's main entrance was chained shut, but Daniel found the side door Marcus had described, unlocked, slightly ajar, leading into darkness that smelled of rust and abandonment. He stepped inside and waited for his eyes to adjust, his body automatically assessing the space for threats and advantages the way it had been trained to do a lifetime ago. "Still punctual, I see." The voice came from above, and Daniel looked up to see Marcus Reeves standing on the second-floor catwalk, backlit by a battery-powered lantern. Even in silhouette, Daniel recognized the compact, powerful build and the way Marcus held himself. Balanced, ready, dangerous. "Some habits stick," Daniel said, moving toward the metal stairs that led up to the catwalk. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, a lonely sound that emphasized how far removed this was from his normal life of mops and maintenance carts. Marcus met him at the top of the stairs, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two men who'd shared violence and survival, who'd trusted each other with their lives, who'd gone their separate ways when Daniel had walked away from everything to become a father. Then Marcus pulled him into a rough embrace that conveyed 7 years of missed connection and unspoken respect. "You look different," Marcus said, stepping back to assess Daniel properly. "Older, softer around the edges." "That was the point," Daniel said. "Fade into civilian life. Become forgettable." "How'd that work out for you?" Marcus asked with dark humor. "About as well as you'd expect." Daniel followed Marcus into a makeshift operations center that had been set up in what used to be a supervisor's office. Maps covered one wall, laptop computers glowed on a salvaged desk, and tactical gear was organized with military precision on tables that looked like they'd been dragged in from somewhere else. 2 other people were in the room. A woman in her early 40s with cropped blonde hair and the lean build of a distance runner, and a younger man, maybe 30, with the kind of careful stillness that suggested sniper training. Daniel recognized them both from operations that felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. "Danny Cross," the woman said, smiling slightly. "Or should I call you Daniel the janitor now?" "Sarah," Daniel acknowledged. Sarah Chen had been their communications specialist and tactical planner, someone whose mind worked 3 steps ahead of everyone else's. "Good to see you're still in the game." "Someone has to keep these boys from getting themselves killed," Sarah said. "This is Jackson Torres. He wasn't on the team when you left, but he's good. Former Marine Scout sniper. Impeccable credentials. Torres nodded at Daniel, his expression neutral and assessing. Heard stories about you. The guys talk about the Istanbul operation like it was some kind of legend. Istanbul was luck and bad intelligence meeting at the wrong moment, Daniel said, not wanting to revisit operations that belonged to someone he'd tried to stop being. What matters now is whether you can help me protect my daughter from cartel retaliation. Marcus gestured to the wall where a detailed map of the city had been marked with various locations. We've been running surveillance since we arrived 6 hours ago. The Alvarez cartel's local operation is centered here. He pointed to a warehouse near the port, with satellite locations for distribution and money laundering. They've got approximately 30 active operatives in the city, plus police contacts they've been using for intelligence. Had police contacts, Daniel corrected. 5 dirty cops were arrested yesterday. Their intelligence network is compromised. Which makes them dangerous, Sarah added, pulling up files on her laptop. Cornered animals bite hardest. They've lost millions in product, their protective infrastructure, and operational security. They're going to lash out, and you're target number 1 because you're the visible catalyst for their losses. Daniel studied the map, his mind automatically processing tactical data. What's their leadership structure look like locally? Marcus pulled up surveillance photos, 3 men, all Latino, ranging in age from late 30s to mid-50s. Miguel Alvarez runs the operation. He's the nephew of the cartel's founder, smart but brutal, absolutely loyal to the family business. His lieutenants are Carlos Ruiz, who handles enforcement, and Javier Santos, who manages distribution. Between the 3 of them, they control everything that moves through this city. Ruiz is the one who sent the kill team to your apartment, Sarah said. We intercepted communications confirming it. He's also planning another attempt, probably within 48 hours. They want you dead before you can testify or provide more intelligence to the police. Daniel felt cold certainty settling in his chest. Then we need to make them rethink that strategy. That's why we're here, Marcus said. The question is how aggressive you want to get. We can run defensive operations, protection details, counter-surveillance, basically keeping you alive until the heat dies down. Or we can go offensive, make it clear that targeting you comes with unacceptable costs. Offensive, Daniel said without hesitation. Defensive just delays the problem. I need them to decide permanently that I'm not worth the trouble. Torres spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone comfortable with violence. Offensive means casualties, means sending a message that's written in blood. You ready for that? Ready to go back to being what you were? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Daniel thought about Emma sleeping safely with Mrs. Chen, about the life he'd built cleaning floors and staying invisible, about all the promises he'd made himself, about never returning to the person he'd been. Then he thought about the kill team at his apartment door, about the threat hanging over his daughter's future, about Hayes' warning that the cartel would keep coming until they succeeded or someone made them stop. I'm ready, Daniel said. But we do this smart, targeted. We remove their leadership's ability to threaten civilians without starting a war that endangers everyone in the city. Marcus nodded slowly, respect showing in his eyes. That's the Danny I remember, always trying to minimize collateral damage even when the mission required hard choices. He turned to the map, his finger tracing a route. Here's what we're thinking. Simultaneous strikes on all 3 leadership targets. We remove Alvarez, Ruiz, and Santos in a coordinated operation that makes it look like a rival cartel is moving in on their territory. False flag operation, Sarah explained. We use tactics and weapons associated with the Sinaloa cartel. When the Alvarez organization tries to figure out what happened, their natural assumption will be competition, not retaliation from a janitor they were targeting. That's clean, Daniel admitted. Removes the threat while misdirecting any blowback. But it requires perfect coordination. If even one target survives and figures out what actually happened, we know, Marcus interrupted, which is why we're not doing this halfway. 3 teams, 3 targets, simultaneous execution. You take Alvarez with me. Sarah runs Overwatch and communications. Torres handles Santos. We bring in 2 more operators for Ruiz, guys you don't know, but who I'd trust with my life. Daniel studied the map, his tactical mind already running scenarios. What's the timeline? Tomorrow night, Marcus said. 24 hours to finalize planning and positioning. All three targets are scheduled to be at their respective locations for weekly meetings. Alvarez at the port warehouse, Santos at a restaurant he uses for business, Ruiz at a private club. We hit them hard, fast, and coordinated at exactly 2300 hours. And the locals? Police response? Daniel asked. The precinct will be notified of suspicious activity at the port warehouse at 2315, Sarah said. By the time they arrive, we'll be gone, and they'll find evidence of cartel-on-cartel violence. Clean scene, no witnesses, nothing to connect back to you or your involvement. It was a solid plan, the kind of operation Daniel had executed dozens of times in his previous life. But those operations had been sanctioned, conducted under authority that provided legal and moral cover. This was vigilante action, extrajudicial violence that crossed lines Daniel had sworn not to cross anymore. But those lines had been drawn when his life was simple, when he didn't have a daughter sleeping 3 miles away under protection that might not hold if professional killers kept coming. "I'm in," Daniel said, "but I need something from you first." "Name it," Marcus said. "If this goes wrong, if I get caught or killed, I need Emma protected. Full coverage until she's 18, money for her education and living expenses, someone watching over her who can't be bought or intimidated." Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands had clenched into fists. "That's non-negotiable. She doesn't pay for my choices." Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Marcus nodded. "Already arranged. We've set up a trust fund in her name, $500,000 that releases on her 18th birthday. If anything happens to you, she goes to a family in Denver. Good people, former operators who owe me more favors than I can count. She'll be safe, educated, and loved. You have my word." The relief that washed through Daniel was almost physical. Whatever happened tomorrow night, whatever consequences came from the choices he was making, Emma would be protected. That certainty made everything else bearable. "Then let's plan this properly," Daniel said, moving to the table where tactical maps were spread out. "Show me everything you've got on the 3 targets." They worked through the night, refining the operation with the meticulous attention to detail that kept people alive in high-risk situations. Daniel's skills came back with unsettling ease, reading floor plans, identifying vulnerabilities, calculating timing and movement patterns. It was like slipping into an old coat that still fit despite years in storage. At 4 a.m., Marcus called a break. They'd worked through every contingency, every potential complication, until the plan was as solid as they could make it. Daniel checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Hayes, probably wondering why he wasn't answering. He'd deal with that later. "You should get some sleep," Sarah said, noticing Daniel's exhaustion. "We've got portable cots set up in the next room. You'll need to be sharp tomorrow." "I need to check on Emma first," Daniel said. "Make sure she's okay." "We've had eyes on Mrs. Chen's apartment since you arrived," Sarah said, pulling up a video feed on her laptop. "Your daughter's asleep. 2 officers outside. No unusual activity. She's safe." Daniel stared at the video feed showing Emma's peaceful sleeping form visible through a window. Mrs. Chen's apartment dark and quiet. The surveillance should have bothered him, the invasion of privacy, the professional observation of his personal life. But right now, it was just reassurance that the most important person in his world was protected. "Thank you," he said quietly. He managed 3 hours of sleep on a cot that smelled like mildew and old canvas, his dreams fragmenting between memories of past operations and anxiety about the one coming. When he woke, pale morning light was filtering through the boarded windows, and Marcus was already up, checking equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done pre-operation rituals 1,000 times. "Coffee's on the table," Marcus said without looking up. "Figured you'd need it." Daniel poured himself a cup from a thermos, the coffee strong and bitter and exactly what his body needed. "What time do the others arrive?" 2 hours, Marcus said. "Torres is running final surveillance on Santos's location. The guys handling Ruiz should be here by 0900. He paused, setting down the weapon he'd been inspecting. "You sure about this, Danny? Once we move, there's no walking it back." "I'm sure," Daniel said, though the certainty felt heavier than it had last night. "Because there are other options," Marcus pressed. "Witness protection, relocation. Hell, you could just take Emma and disappear on your own. Use the skills you've got to stay ahead of anyone looking.
You don't have to go back to being what you were. Daniel thought about that, running again, building another life somewhere else, teaching Emma that safety meant constant movement and false identities, or accepting witness protection and watching her grow up knowing her father was always looking over his shoulder, never truly free. Those aren't options, Daniel said. Those are just different kinds of prisons. Emma deserves better than growing up scared or hidden. She deserves a normal life where she can have friends and go to school and not worry that tomorrow will have to pack up and disappear. And you think killing 3 cartel leaders gives her that? Marcus asked. I think removing the immediate threat and creating the impression that someone more dangerous than me is responsible for it gives her that, Daniel corrected. The false flag operation protects her by making me irrelevant to their business calculations. If they think a rival cartel is moving on their territory, they stop thinking about the janitor who interfered with one operation. Marcus considered that, then nodded slowly. You always were better at the strategic thinking than the rest of us. Most operators just focused on the mission. You focused on what came after. The rest of the team arrived as promised. 2 more operators Daniel didn't know, but who carried themselves with the professional competence that spoke to serious training and experience. They ran through the operation one more time, everyone clear on their roles and responsibilities, then began final equipment checks. Daniel found himself handling weapons he hadn't touched in 7 years, the weight and balance achingly familiar. A Sig Sauer P226 pistol with suppressor, a compact MP7 for close quarters work, flashbang grenades and breaching charges. Tools of violence wrapped in tactical necessity. You remember how to use those? Torres asked, watching Daniel perform functions checks with automatic precision. Like riding a bike, Daniel said, though the comparison felt obscene. Some skills don't fade. At 6:00 p.m., Daniel made a call he'd been dreading. Hayes answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry and anger. Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for 18 hours. Working on my problem, Daniel said carefully. The one I asked for 72 hours to solve. Cross, if you're planning what I think you're planning, you don't know what I'm planning, Daniel interrupted, and you don't want to know. Plausible deniability, detective. Sometimes it's a gift. Hayes was quiet for a moment. If you get yourself killed doing something stupid, Emma becomes an orphan. Have you thought about that? I've thought about nothing else, Daniel said, which is exactly why I'm doing this. Hayes, I need you to trust me, just for tonight. Tomorrow morning, Emma's threat level drops to near 0, and I can consider Morrison's job offer or witness protection or whatever other normal solution exists. But tonight, I need you to look the other way. I'm a cop, Cross. Looking the other way isn't really in my job description. You're a cop who just spent weeks investigating corruption that got good people hurt, Daniel countered. You know better than anyone that sometimes the system can't fix what's broken. Sometimes you need people willing to operate outside those boundaries. Another long silence. Then Hayes sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. I don't want to know the details. But Cross, whatever you're doing, don't make me regret trusting you, and don't make Emma's life worse trying to make it better. I won't, Daniel promised. One way or another, this ends tonight. After ending the call, Daniel checked in with Mrs. Chen, who reported that Emma had eaten dinner and was working on homework, completely unaware that her father was 12 hours away from violence that would determine the shape of their future. She asks about you, Mrs. Chen said. Wants to know when you're coming home. Tell her soon, Daniel said. Tell her I love her and I'll see her tomorrow morning. You promise me you will see her tomorrow morning, Mrs. Chen said, not asking. I promise, Daniel said, hoping it wasn't a lie. The operation launched at 10:45 p.m. with final positioning. Daniel rode with Marcus to the port district, both of them silent in the darkness, minds focused on the work ahead. Torres and his partner were already in position outside the restaurant where Santos conducted business. The team handling Ruiz had confirmed their target's arrival at the private club. Everything was synchronized, coordinated, ready to execute with the precision that separated professionals from amateurs. The port warehouse was a sprawling complex of loading docks and storage facilities, mostly empty this time of night except for the section Alvarez used for his operations. Marcus parked 3 blocks away, and they moved on foot through shadows, their dark clothing and practiced movement making them nearly invisible. Targets on the second floor,
Sarah's voice came through their earpieces. 2 guards at the main entrance, 3 inside with Alvarez. Thermal imaging shows no additional personnel. Copy, Marcus whispered. Torres, Santos status? In position, Torres responded. Target confirmed. Ready on your mark. Ruiz team? Ready, came the third confirmation. Daniel and Marcus reached the warehouse's side entrance, where Daniel's skills with locks proved useful despite years of disuse. They were inside in under 30 seconds, moving through the ground floor with weapons ready, each covering the other's angles with the practiced efficiency of partners who'd worked together for years. The guards at the stairwell never heard them coming. Marcus took the first with a suppressed double tap that dropped the man silently. Daniel took the second with a blade, faster and quieter than Gunfire, his muscle memory executing techniques he'd hoped never to use again. They dragged the bodies into a storage room and continued up the stairs, Daniel's heart rate steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. This was the part that made him different from most operators, the ability to stay calm in chaos, to think tactically while executing violently. At the door, Marcus whispered, breaching in 5. All teams execute on 3 count. Daniel positioned himself beside the door to Alvarez's office, shaped charges ready to blow the hinges while Marcus prepared for entry. Through the door, they could hear voices, Alvarez speaking Spanish, something about shipment schedules and replacement personnel for the cops who'd been arrested. All teams, Marcus said quietly. 3, 2, 1, execute. The charges blew simultaneously with Torres's entry at the restaurant and the Ruiz team's breach at the private club. Daniel was through the door before the smoke cleared, his MP7 acquiring targets with mechanical precision. 3 men tried to reach for weapons. None of them made it. Alvarez was behind his desk, hands raised, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that his world had just ended. Daniel covered him while Marcus swept the room for additional threats. "Who sent you?" Alvarez demanded in accented English. "Sinaloa? You tell them this is a mistake. We can negotiate." "This isn't negotiation," Marcus said coldly, placing evidence they'd prepared. Shell casings from weapons commonly used by the Sinaloa cartel, a cartel symbol spray-painted on the wall, digital communications between the 2 organizations that had been fabricated with careful detail. Daniel fired 3 rounds center mass. Alvarez slumped across his desk, and it was over. They had 45 seconds to exit before police response times caught up with them. Sarah's voice confirmed the other teams had succeeded. Santos and Ruiz both eliminated, false flag evidence planted, teams extracting safely. Daniel and Marcus were 3 blocks away when sirens converged on the warehouse. They rendezvoused with Sarah at a different location, changed clothes, disposed of weapons and tactical gear in a way that would make them impossible to trace. By midnight, Daniel was in his car heading home, looking like nothing more threatening than a tired janitor finishing a long shift. His phone rang. Hayes. "There's been a shooting at the port," she said, her voice carefully neutral. 3 separate locations, actually. Looks like cartel violence. The victims include Miguel Alvarez, Carlos Ruiz, and Javier Santos, basically the entire leadership structure of the local Alvarez operation. "That's terrible," Daniel said, keeping his voice appropriately shocked. "Do you know what happened?" "Evidence suggests the Sinaloa cartel decided to move on Alvarez territory," Hayes said. "Very professional operation. Very clean. Almost too clean, if you know what I mean." "I don't know what you mean, Detective," Daniel said. Hayes laughed without humor. "Right. Of course you don't." "Well, the interesting thing is that with Alvarez leadership eliminated, the remaining organization is going to be focused on defending against Sinaloa incursion, not continuing vendettas against civilians who interfered with their operations." "Funny how that works out." "Most very funny," Daniel agreed. "Go home to your daughter, Cross," Hayes said. "And when you come in for your shift tomorrow, we should probably talk about Captain Morrison's job offer. Turns out we could really use someone with your particular skills on a more official basis." Daniel ended the call and drove the rest of the way home in silence, processing what he'd just done and what it meant. He'd killed 3 men tonight, orchestrated their deaths with cold tactical precision, crossed lines he'd promised himself he'd never cross again. But Emma was safe. The threat that had hung over their lives was gone. Neutralize not by running or hiding, but by taking direct action to remove the source. Tomorrow morning, she could wake up and go to school and be a normal 8-year-old girl without armed protection watching her every move. That had to be worth something. Had to justify the choices he'd made. Mrs. Chen opened her door before Daniel could knock, her expression knowing and sad. "It's done?" she asked quietly. "It's done," Daniel confirmed. "The dangerous part?" "The dangerous part." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, and Daniel wondered what she saw. The janitor who'd lived in her building for 4 years, or the killer who'd just executed a precision operation that left 3 men dead. Maybe both. Maybe neither. "Emma's asleep in the guest room," Mrs. Chen said. "You can carry her home. But Daniel, tomorrow you start being just her father again. No more dangerous things. No more violence. Just the father she needs." "I promise," Daniel said, and this time he meant it completely. He carried Emma home, her small body warm and trusting in his arms, and tucked her into her own bed. She stirred slightly as he pulled the covers up around her. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily. "You're home." "I'm home, sweetheart," Daniel said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere. Promise?" "Promise." Emma smiled and drifted back to sleep, secure in promises that Daniel could finally make with honest certainty. 3 days later, Daniel accepted Captain Morrison's job offer as a civilian consultant to the investigations unit. The work was part-time, flexible around Emma's schedule, and came with enough compensation that he could afford to cut back on the janitorial shifts. More importantly, it came with official protection. Anyone threatening a police department consultant threatened the department itself. Hayes became his primary contact, and they developed an unexpected partnership built on mutual respect and careful boundaries around questions she didn't ask and answers he didn't give. She was smart enough to know that the port warehouse operation had been more than coincidental timing, but professional enough to accept the gift of plausible deniability. The Alvarez cartel's local operations collapsed in the aftermath of their leadership's elimination. Sinaloa did eventually move into the territory, but they were smart enough to avoid the kind of high-profile violence that brought excessive police attention. The city's drug trade continued, it always did, but without the immediate threat to Daniel's family. Emma adjusted to her father's new schedule with the resilience children had, happy he was home more often, even if she didn't fully understand why. She made friends at school, joined the soccer team, lived the normal life Daniel had fought to preserve. Marcus called occasionally, checking in, offering support if Daniel ever needed the team again. Daniel always said no, but they both knew the door remained open if circumstances changed. Some connections, forged in violence and survival, didn't really end. They just went dormant until necessity required them. 6 months after the warehouse operation, Daniel was cleaning up after a long shift at the precinct when Hayes found him in the break room. She'd been working late on a new case, and exhaustion showed in the lines around her eyes. "Coffee?" Daniel offered, gesturing to the pot he'd just made. "Thanks," Hayes said, accepting the cup. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two people who'd seen each other at their worst and somehow found respect in the aftermath. "You ever regret it?" Hayes asked suddenly. "What you did that night. The choices you made." Daniel thought about that carefully. He thought about 3 men who'd died because he'd decided their threat to his daughter justified their elimination. He thought about lines he'd crossed and skills he'd resurrected, and promises he'd broken to himself about never being that person again. Then he thought about Emma's laugh when he picked her up from school, about parent-teacher conferences and soccer games and ordinary moments that would have been impossible if he'd chosen differently. "No," Daniel said simply. "I don't regret it." Hayes nodded slowly. "Good. Because I'd hate to think we were working with someone who second-guessed themselves when hard choices needed making." "Is that what we're doing?" Daniel asked. "Working together?" "That's exactly what we're doing," Hayes said. "You watch things from your invisible position. I work cases from mine. Together, we keep the city a little safer than it would be otherwise." She paused, then added, "And maybe we keep each other a little safer too." It was the closest thing to friendship Daniel had found since leaving his old life, and he accepted it for what it was. 2 damaged people finding unexpected connection through shared purpose and mutual understanding of what violence sometimes required.
That night, Daniel went home to his apartment where Emma was already asleep and Mrs. Chen was reading in the living room. The old woman looked up when he entered, her expression softening with something like approval. "Better," she said simply. "You look better now than 6 months ago. Less like you're carrying the world." "I had help putting it down," Daniel admitted. "Good," Mrs. Chen said, gathering her things. "Everyone needs help sometimes, even strong men who try to carry everything alone." After Mrs. Chen left, Daniel checked on Emma, sleeping peacefully, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, completely secure in a world her father had fought to make safe. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, thinking about all the choices that had led to this quiet moment. He'd been a soldier once, trained for violence, and deployed in places where moral clarity was a luxury nobody could afford. Then, he'd been a father trying to leave that world behind, building a life of deliberate invisibility and careful distance from anything that might resurrect old instincts. Now he was something in between, a man who cleaned floors and consulted on investigations, who packed school lunches and understood tactical operations, who'd proven he could be both the father Emma needed and the protector she required when civilian solutions failed. It wasn't the life he'd planned. But standing in Emma's doorway, listening to her peaceful breathing, Daniel realized it was exactly the life he'd earned, not through perfection or noble choices, but through doing what was necessary when necessity called, and having the strength to step back into ordinary life when the dangerous work was done. Some people thought strength meant never backing down, never compromising, never showing weakness. Daniel had learned differently. Real strength was knowing when to fight and when to walk away, when to be visible and when to disappear, when to be the dangerous man and when to just be the father. And tonight, standing guard over his sleeping daughter in an apartment that no longer felt threatened, Daniel Cross was exactly who he needed to be, just a father, watching over the only thing in the world that truly mattered, secure in the knowledge that he'd done whatever it took to keep her safe. Tomorrow he'd go back to work at the precinct, pushing his maintenance cart through hallways where officers nodded in recognition but had stopped asking questions about who he really was. He'd empty trash bins and change light bulbs and occasionally notice things that helped Hayes solve cases. He'd live his invisible life that was no longer quite so invisible, but was safe and stable and good enough. And when Emma woke up in the morning, he'd make her breakfast and help her get ready for school and be present for all the ordinary moments that made life worth protecting in the first place. The dangerous man could rest now. The father had work to do.